The screen tore the Tuesday morning open and it wasn't human. A rope built to hold a pair of draft oxen snapped like sewing thread, and the whole market square fell back 15 paces in the space of a single heartbeat. Pigeons burst off the bell tower. A baker's tray rolled into the gutter, spilling rolls into the muck, and nobody moved to pick them up. There in the middle of the cobblestones stood the thing that had done it, Maine, a wreck of burrs and dried mud, eyes rolling white at the edges, coat the color of rusted iron left out in the rain. They said it finished a farrier last month. Gone before the man hit the ground. 2 constables came running out of the pub doorway, then stopped dead, deciding their best contribution to the situation was standing very, very still. "Nobody move," said the man beside the black carriage. "Quiet." Nobody did, except one. Behind the flower stall, a hand let go of a half-tied bundle of chamomile and found a crushed sprig of lavender worth maybe a halfpenny to someone desperate. Then she stepped out. 3 years. Marianne Colter had sold flowers in Ashmore Market Square. 3 years of rising before the sun to cut what needed cutting, to bundle what needed bundling, to lay out chamomile and lavender and rosemary on a plank table that wobbled if you leaned on the wrong corner. 3 years of learning which widow needed feverfew for her headaches, and which farmer's wife needed raspberry leaf for the baby coming in spring, and never once telling either of them that she'd once stood in rooms where king's own horses were fitted for parade, where her word on a buckle or a strap had carried the weight of law. Nobody in Ashmore knew that. That was the whole point of Ashmore. Nobody knew anything about her except what she let them see, and what she let them see was small and quiet and easy to overlook. A woman with steady hands and a gift for herbs. A woman who kept to herself, who didn't gossip, who paid her rent on time even in the lean months. She'd built that life carefully. Brick by brick, the way you build something you intend to hide inside of. Because the alternative, the truth spoken out loud, to anyone who might ask, was a story nobody in a market town would believe. A disgraced crown trainer stripped of rank, blamed for a dead man's near miss and a broken arm, and an embarrassment the newspapers had chewed over for a solid month before moving on to something else. Except he hadn't died. She reminded herself of that some nights, when the guilt crept in sideways, uninvited. The officer who'd been thrown from that gray gelding had lived, recovered in time, though the arm never set quite right, and he walked now with a slight favor to his left side that would follow him the rest of his days. She hadn't caused that. She said it to herself the way you say a prayer you're not entirely sure still works. She hadn't caused it. She'd inspected that buckle the night before, run her fingers along every rivet, every the way she'd been trained to do 1,000 times before, and the metal had been sound, whole, trustworthy. Someone had made it otherwise, sometime in the hours between her final inspection and the parade itself, and she had never been given the chance to prove it, because proving it would have required an investigation nobody wanted to fund, and an inquiry nobody wanted to reopen once the convenient answer had already been written down and signed. So she'd left, not fled exactly. Nobody had chased her out of the Capitol with pitchfork. But there had been a particular quality to the silence that followed her dismissal. Old colleagues, who stopped meeting her eyes in the street, invitations that quietly dried up, a landlady who found, with great regret, that she needed the room back after all, and she'd understood, eventually, that staying meant living the rest of her life as the woman who broke the buckle, whether or not it was true. She'd taken what savings she had, found a cart heading west, ended up in Ashmore because the cart stopped there and she was too tired to ask it to go further. The flower stall had come almost by accident. She'd always known herbs, her grandmother's trade, learned at the old woman's elbow before she was old enough to understand what half the plants were for, and it turned out a market town always needed someone who understood which root eased a fever and which leaf calmed a cough. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't pay well. But it was honest and it was quiet. And quiet was what she'd needed more than anything else in those first raw months. She'd told herself, more than once, that this was simply her life now. That the woman who'd once held the highest civilian rank in the royal stables had died somewhere on that parade ground, and what remained was someone smaller, someone content to sell chamomile to tired mothers and lavender to grieving widows, and never touch another horse worth more than the cart that had carried her out of the Capitol. She'd almost believed it some days. Other days, in the gray hour just before dawn, she woke with her hands already moving through the old exercises, the 2-finger press, the circular motion along an imaginary jaw, before her conscious mind had caught up to remind her, no horse in the small room above the drying yard. Just her own hands moving through a language she'd never quite managed to forget, practicing on air. She kept the old satchel, kept the pouches inside it, refreshed each season, chamomile and lavender and sage and meadowsweet, though she told herself it was only habit, only the same careful preparation any herb seller kept for her trade. She knew it wasn't only that. Some part of her, the part that still woke some mornings reaching for a bridle that wasn't there, had never quite let go of who she used to be. Had kept the old language alive in her hands the way a person keeps a plangs alive, by whispering it to themselves in an empty room, just to hear the shape of the words again. She hadn't expected to need it. Not until the morning the smell reached the square before the sound did. The smell reached the square before the sound did. Iron sweat. Something wilder underneath. Something that didn't belong in a market town on a Tuesday morning. Marianne Colter smelled it from behind her flower stall, and her hands stopped moving. Mid-knot. A bundle of dried chamomile hanging half-tied between her fingers. Then came the scream, not human, not close to human, a sound that rolled across the cobblestones like a cannon going off in a church, and every pigeon on the bell tower took flight at once, and every merchant, every beggar, every housewife with a basket on her hip, froze mid-step like the whole square had been struck by lightning. Ashmore held its breath. Marianne didn't. She stood, slowly. The way you stand when your body already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. A black carriage came first, lacquered wood. Brass fittings catching the gray morning light. The Ashworth crest painted in deep red and gold on the door, and the coachman sitting so rigid on his bench you'd think his spine had been replaced with a fence post. His whip lay across his knees, untouched. A man who'd already learned the hard way that some things don't respond to a whip behind the carriage. Chained. Bound to an iron transport rig on wheels, 3 men gripping 3 separate ropes and bracing with their full weight, was the thing making that sound. He was enormous, 17 hands if he was an inch, and his coat was the color of rusted iron left out in the rain, dark and burning and catching the light wrong, turning something beautiful into something that made your stomach drop. His mane was a wreck of burrs and dried mud. His eyes were rolling white at the edges. One of the handlers lost his footing, just like that. Dragged 3 feet across wet stone before he let go of the rope and scrambled backward on his hands like a crab fleeing a boot. The crowd gasped and pulled back. 10 paces, 15. A baker's tray hit the gutter and rolled spilling rolls into the muck and nobody moved to pick them up. That's the Duke's new warhorse, someone near Marianne's stall, whispering like the horse might hear his name and take offense. Bought off a cavalry outfit up north. They say he finished a farrier last month. Finished him? Kicked him. Gone before the man hit the ground. Marianne said nothing, she watched. The carriage door opened and a man stepped down in a dark gray coat, no hat, which the older women found improper, and which he clearly didn't care about in the slightest. Edmund Ashworth. 35, sharp-jawed, the kind of eyes that looked at everything like they were doing arithmetic behind the calm. Hold him steady. His voice cut clean across the square. Get the halter chain to the post ring. We're trying, Your Grace. The sentence never finished. The stallion reared. Hoofs came down on the iron rig with a sound like a blacksmith's hammer striking a bell, and the left restraining bolt groaned. Bent, the horse screamed again and lunged full weight, and the lead rope snapped like a thread pulled too tight. Chaos. Real chaos. Women screaming, a cart of cabbages going over. 2 constables running out of the pub doorway and then stopping dead the second they saw the size of what was loose in the square. Deciding their best contribution to the situation was standing very, very still. Ironclad, the papers called him. Ironclad stood in the center of Ashmore with a broken rope trailing behind him like a dead snake, blowing hard through flared nostrils, ears pinned flat, every muscle coiled, every hoof striking the stone in short, furious stamps. Edmund stood beside the carriage, face unmoved, hand gripping the door frame hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Nobody move, he said, quiet. Nobody did. Except Marianne. She never decided to do it. That was the strange part. The part she wouldn't be able to explain later. Not to Edmund, not to anyone. Her hands moved before her thoughts caught up. Reached under the stall counter. Found the bruised lavender bundle, the one too dry to sell at full price, worth maybe a halfpenny to someone desperate. She stepped out. Miss. A constable's hiss. She didn't hear him. Or she did, and it simply didn't matter. She ticked forward. Across the empty stones toward the trembling, furious animal that had just terrified an entire town. And she began to whistle, low, so low the people 10 feet away couldn't catch it. 2 notes, rising, falling, rising, falling. A lullaby with no words hummed through barely parted lips. Ironclad's ears twitched. His stamping slowed. She kept walking. Kept the lavender open in her palm. Arm loose, not stiff, not reaching. She didn't look him in the eye. Her gaze rested somewhere near his shoulder, soft. Like she was looking at something far past him. His nostrils flared, caught the scent. Something in that huge body shifted. A fist, he lowered his head. Zun stepped forward, then another. And then his muzzle came to rest gently directly against her open palm. Silence. Total silence in a square that had been screaming 30 seconds earlier. The great horse stood there, breathing into her hand, eyes half closed, body still. Her free hand rose, rest against the flat plane of his cheek. Same 2 notes. And the stallion let out a long shuddering breath, the sound of a man setting down something he'd carried too far for too long. 15 seconds, that was all it took. 15 seconds, and the animal that had put an entire market square to flight stood as quiet as a church pony under the hand of a woman who sold flowers for a living. Edmund's mouth opened, closed, and before he could speak, before anyone could ask her name, grab her sleeve, demand an explanation, Marianne withdrew her hand, tucked the crushed lavender back into her apron, slipped sideways.
Gone as.
Swallowed by the crowd between the stalls before anyone thought to reach for her. Nothing left but the smell of dried flowers. And a horse standing perfectly still for the first time in months. Edmund turned to his attendant. Jaw tight. Find her, Your Grace, I don't care what it takes. Find that woman before sundown. Ironclad wouldn't move. They tried everything, fresh oats in a brass bucket. Apples dangled from a stick like he was some overgrown pony at a village fair. A young groom, 16, brave in the way 16-year-olds are brave right up until the moment they aren't, approached from the rear with a rope halter, and got within 3 feet before a back kick cracked a lean in half. The boy didn't try again. By afternoon, the stable master arrived with 4 experienced men, 20 years handling cavalry mounts between them. Ironclad pinned his ears, bared his teeth, and drove all 4 of them backward across the square like sheep running from a dog they hadn't expected to be quite so large. The stable master threw his cap on the ground. He's cursed, he said flatly, wiping his forehead. He wants the girl, whatever she did to him, he wants her back. Until she's here, that horse isn't moving, and I'm not losing a man's ribs over it. Edmund stood on the steps of the coaching inn, watching, jaw so tight you could have struck a match on it. His schedule ruined. A stable full of horses waiting back at the manor. A head trainer expecting delivery by noon. And instead he was standing in a market town, watching a 1,200-pound animal hold an entire square hostage, because a flower seller had touched its face. Your Grace. Colton, his valet from just behind his shoulder. Careful. Shall I send for the surgeon? He may have a draft strong enough to sedate the animal for transport. I'm not drugging a horse I paid 400 guineas for, Colton. Very good, sir. Edmund pulled his gloves off, tucked them away. The woman. The one with the laver name? Colton hesitated. Stall, sir. Several know her by sight, a Miss Marianne Colter. Keeps a small flower stall here on market days, lives somewhere in the lower lanes. Nobody's certain of the exact address, then I'll find it myself. Colton blinked. Sir, but Edmund was already walking, long strides, carrying him off the inn steps and across the square, toward the narrow mouth of a side lane, where the cobblestones turned uneven and the buildings leaned close enough overhead to swallow the afternoon sky. The lower lanes were a different country entirely. Tallow smoke. Coal, the sharp bite of leather from the workshops lining the first stretch of alley. Washing lines crossed overhead, heavy with gray linens, and an old woman with a basket of mending flattened herself against the wall as he passed, eyes wide at a coat that probably cost more her house. He asked at the chandler's, pointed further down, asked at the cobbler. A vague gesture, a mumbled word about the quiet one with the herbs, a finger pointing him around a corner toward a row of small cottages backing onto the old drying yards. He found it at the end of a dead-end alley, slate roof, a wooden door once painted green, now mostly bare timber. Bundles of dried flowers hanging from iron hooks along the front wall, lavender, rosemary, thyme, chamomile, and the smell was extraordinary. Sweet. Deep. Layered. Like walking straight into a memory of summer that hadn't happened yet. He knocked twice, the door opened a few inches. Marianne looked out at him with the expression of a woman who'd been expecting this and dreading it in equal measure. Out of her market apron now. Plain brown dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark hair pulled back with a cloth hand stained yellow and purple with flower dye. 30 years old, a face more interesting than pretty. Strong brows, a firm mouth. Gray eyes that didn't flinch. Miss Colter, Your Grace. She didn't curtsy. Didn't open the door wider. You know why I'm here, your horse won't move. And you think I'm the reason? I don't think it. I watched it happen. A beat. That animal has thrown every handler I've hired. He put a farrier in bed for a month. Broke a lead rope built to hold draft oxen. And you walked up to him with a handful of dead flowers. He stood still like a lamb. Her mouth tightened. He was frightened. Frightened animals aren't dangerous because they want to be. They're dangerous because nobody bothers to ask what's wrong. And you asked him? In a manner of speaking. Edmund studied her. Behind him faint carried on the wind the sound of Ironclad screaming again. And men shouting somewhere back towards the square. Time running short. I'll pay you £5 a week, he said. Room and board at the manor. Full access to the stables. All I need is for you to manage this horse until he's rideable. A fortnight if your skill is genuine. £5 a week. Her face didn't change. But her hand tightened on the doorframe. £5 was more than 2 months at the flower stall. Enough to clear the back rent 3 times over. Enough to eat meat more than once a week. Enough to stop counting candle stubs like they were gold. I have my stall, she said. My customers depend on me for their remedies. I'll have someone tend it while you're away. You won't lose a buyer. Silence, several seconds of it. One condition, she said finally. Nobody puts a chain on that horse while I'm responsible for him. No iron bits, no tie-down, no hobbles. If your stable hands can't agree to that, I won't come. Edmund almost smiled. Done. We leave within the hour. Pack what you need. The door closed in his face. He heard her moving inside, drawers opening. Things being gathered. He turned and walked back up the alley, toward the square, where Ironclad still stood exactly where she'd left him. Waiting for a hand that smelled like lavender to come back and tell him it was safe. The carriage ride took the better part of 2 hours. Marianne spent most of it watching the countryside change through the small window. The cramped lanes of Ashmore gave way to open farmland, then rolling hills dotted with sheep, and finally the long approach road lined with elms that led to the manor. She'd heard of the estate, everyone in the county had. But hearing about a place and seeing it were 2 entirely different animals. The house sat on a gentle rise above a shallow valley, pale stone stretching wider than any building she'd ever stood inside. Tall windows catching the midday sun. Ivy climbing the eastern wing in thick dark sheets. A formal garden out front, clipped hedges, gravel paths, stone urns overflowing with late roses. Beyond it, the stable block, red brick. A clock tower above the central arch. Big enough to hold 30 horses without breathing hard. The carriage rolled to a stop. A footman opened the door and offered his hand, and she took it without thinking, then immediately felt strange about it. Used to stepping over puddles and horse dung in market lanes. Here was a man in a powdered wig helping her down onto swept flagstones like she was made of glass. Edmund had ridden ahead on a borrowed hack and stood waiting in the courtyard already. Beside him, a row of stable staff, 6 grooms in matching brown coats, 2 farriers in leather aprons, and at the front of it all, hands clasped behind his back, chin lifted at an angle that suggested he'd practiced it in a mirror. Cormac Wexley, chief stablemaster. Broad shoulders gone slightly soft with age, 58 years old, though he carried himself like a man who refused to admit it. A face like a side of beef left out too long in the sun. Gray whiskers, bristling. Small eyes set deep beneath brows drawn permanently into disapproval. Dark green riding coat. Brass buttons, boots polished to a shine that could have blinded a man at 40 paces. He looked at Marianne the way a man looks at a stain on his good tablecloth. Miss Colter, Edmund said, gesturing. Master Wexley oversees equine operations here. Tuos fiddletor work joy to us temper Ironclad. Temporarily Wexley let the word hang in the air. Long enough that its meaning was unmistakable. A short, stiff nod. Zero warmth in it. Welcome to the estate, Miss Colter. I trust you'll still be brief, pleasant, even. Behind them the transport rig rolled through the gate. Ironclad had been calm on the road. She'd walked alongside for the first quarter mile, one hand on his neck until he settled enough for her to ride in the carriage. But the courtyard, new smells, new sounds, and his head came up. Ears swiveling. Right then. Wexley stepped forward, reclaiming his territory. I'll take charge from here. Get the unloading ropes. We'll walk him to the east wing box, standard procedure. 2 grooms stepped up with heavy hemp ropes. I wouldn't, Marianne said. Quiet. Wexley turned. His small eyes narrowed, which hardly seemed anatomically possible. I beg your pardon? He doesn't know this place yet. The ropes will make him feel trapped. Give me 10 minutes with him first. I'll walk him in freely. Wexley's face darkened to match the brick behind him. He looked at Edmund, expecting support. Edmund folded his arms, watched with an expression of polite interest that committed to absolutely nothing. Miss Colter. Wexley's voice dropped, careful, controlled, the tone of a man dangerously close to saying something he shouldn't in front of his employer. I have managed this stable 19 years. I have broken colts, trained hunters, prepared war horses for 3 cavalry regiments. I believe I can handle 1 stallion. He turned on his heel, took a lead rope from the nearest groom, walked toward the rig. What happened next took about 8 seconds. Wexley reached for the halter. Ironclad pulled back hard against the iron frame. Wexley pulled harder, put his weight in, and made the mistake, the fatal, obvious mistake of raising his voice. A sharp bark that echoed off the courtyard walls. The stallion exploded, lunged forward. Teeth bared. Wexley staggered back so fast he sat down on the cobblestones with a thud that knocked the air clean out of him. One groom dropped his rope and ran. The other stood frozen, mouth open as Ironclad screamed and kicked hard enough to rock the rag sideways on its was. Enough. Mare walked past Wexley. Sitting on the ground, dignity scattered around him like broken crockery, didn't look at the grooms, didn't look at the Duke, walked straight to the side of the rig, placed her open palm flat against Ironclad's chest, not his face, not his neck, the chest, right where the heartbeat thundered closest to the surface, and held it there. No whistling this time, no words, just her hand and her breathing, slow and even until his breathing matched her 10 seconds.
20.
The kicking stopped. The screaming faded to a low, rumbling snort. His head dropped. He leaned into her palm like it was the only solid thing left in a world that kept shifting under his hooves. She reached up with her other hand, unclipped the restraining chain, turned, walked toward the open stable door. Ironclad followed her like a dog follows the one person who's ever been kind to it. The courtyard was dead silent as the flower seller led the unrideable warhorse into his new stall without a single rope chain or raised voice. Wexley climbed slowly to his feet, brushed the dust from his coat, stared at the stable door long after they'd both disappeared through it. 19 years. 19 years running this stable, and some girl from a market stall had just made him look like a fool. In front of his own men. In front of his own employer. He picked up his fallen cap, set it back on his head, walked stiffly toward the tack room without a word. His hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into fists so tight the knuckles had gone the color of old bone. Nobody saw his face change. That was the thing about Cormac Wexley. 2 decades in this business had taught him exactly one skill that mattered more than horsemanship. And it was this: how to lose in front of people without letting them see what losing cost you. He'd learned it the hard way. Long before Vance Manor. Long before any of these soft-handed grooms who'd never once had to hold a line under artillery fire while a terrified horse screamed in your ear, and men were dying 20 feet away. And somebody had to be calm. Somebody had to keep the animals from bolting into the guns. He'd been that somebody once. A long time ago, 32 years ago, when he was a young man of 26 under a commanding officer whose face he still saw some nights when the wind rattled to the stables just right. Aldous Merrow. He didn't let himself think the name often. Tonight he let himself think it exactly once. Standing in the dark of the tack room with his back against the cold wall, breathing through his nose until the shaking in his hands settled, Merrow had pulled him out of a collapsed picket line with his own 2 hands. Dragged him 50 yards through smoke and horseflesh, while a shell landed close enough to deafen them both for a week. Wexley's had owed that man his life for 32 years now, and some debts don't have an expiration date. Some debts you carry until the day you're in the ground. So when the letter came 3 weeks ago now, sealed with Merrow's own hand, asking quietly, almost gently, for a small favor concerning a certain warhorse and a certain young duke's ambitions, Wexley hadn't thought of it as betrayal. He'd thought of it as payment. Overdue payment on an account that had been open for too long. He hadn't expected the flower girl. He rubbed his face with both hands. In the dark, alone, nobody performing for him now. His shoulders sagged in a way they never did in daylight. 19 years, he muttered to the empty room. To nobody. 19 years and I'm undone by lavender. He almost laughed. It came out closer to a cough. Because that was the joke of it, wasn't it? He'd spent 2 decades building a reputation on discipline, for the iron certainty of a man who never let an animal win. And here came a woman half his age with a handful of dead flowers and a whistle too soft to hear past 10 feet, undoing everything he'd built in 15 seconds flat. Except it wasn't really about the horse. He knew that much, even sitting alone in the dark telling himself otherwise. It was about the letter in his coat pocket, the one he hadn't answered yet. The one that would need answering soon. One way or another, because Merrow's patience had a very definite edge to it, and Wexley had seen what happened to people who tested that edge and came up short. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat, read it again in the dark, though he'd read it so many times now the words barely needed the light. Just make the animal difficult, Cormac. That's all I ask. A horse that fights its rider is worth nothing to a duke building his reputation on it. You needn't harm the creature. Simply remind him and remind the county that some things cannot be trained out of an animal, no matter how gentle the hand. It had seemed simple enough 3 weeks ago. It didn't seem simple now. Wexley folded the letter, put it back in his coat, told himself it would be easier tomorrow. It wasn't. Dawn came gray and damp. The stable clock struck 6, and Marianne was already in the private training paddock behind the east wing, alone with Ironclad, before the grooms had even lit the kitchen fires. Before the first blackbird had started singing in the elms. She dressed in the dark, pulled on riding boots the housekeeper had found for her, too large by half a size, stuffed with rags at the toe, and walked across the wet courtyard with a canvas satchel over her shoulder. The satchel was the key to everything. Inside it, small cloth pouches, lavender, chamomile, lemon balm, dried apple peel, a particular blend of crushed sage and meadowsweet she'd mixing since she was 14 years old. Each pouch a different scent, a different purpose, a different word in a language she'd spent years building between herself and the animals she worked with. She opened the paddock gate. Let Ironclad walk through on his own. No rope, no halter. The stallion moved into the open space cautiously, head low, ears turning in every direction, reading the new landscape the way a sailor reads an unfamiliar coastline. She closed the gate behind her, sat down in the wet grass near the fence rail, waited. This was the part most horse people got wrong, and she'd learned it the hardest way there was to learn anything. They saw a difficult animal and their first instinct was to do something. Pull a rope, crack a whip, shout a command. Fill the silence with authority, because silence made them nervous, because silence felt like losing. But the silence was where the real work happened. In the silence, the horse could think, could breathe, could decide on his own terms whether the person sitting in the wet grass was a threat or something else entirely. Ironclad circled the paddock twice at a nervous trot, tail high, nostrils wide. He paused at the far corner, stared down a pheasant that burst from the hedge, snorted, stamped once, kept moving. Circuit, his pace slowed. Fourth. He stopped 15 feet from where she sat and turned to face her. She didn't look at him directly. Pulled a pouch of chamomile from her satchel. Opened it, held it loose in her lap. The scent drifted across the morning air, warm, sweet, familiar. The same scent layered under the lavender in the square. His ears came forward. She began to speak. Not commands. Not the clipped, sharp tones stable hands used on animals like they were furniture that occasionally misbehaved. She spoke the way you talk to a child waking from a bad dream. Low, steady, unhurried. She told him about the weather, about the color of the mist in the valley that morning, about a blackbird she'd heard on the walkover and how its song had reminded her of a cottage she'd lived in once, years and years ago, where a bird used to sit on the windowsill every morning and sing until she brought it breadcrumbs. The words didn't matter. The sound did. The rhythm. The steady, predictable cadence of a voice that asked nothing, threatened nothing, and simply filled the space between them with something warm. Ironclad took a step forward, then another, then crossed the remaining distance in a slow walk and lowered his great head until his muzzle hovered just above her open hand. She let him breathe in the chamomile, let him lip at the dried flowers. When his muscles had softened, when his breathing had deepened, she raised her free hand, placed it against the side of his jaw, just below the ear. Pressed gently with 2 fingers, held, released. Pressed again, held 3 seconds, released. A pattern, a signal, something old and deliberate and precise. 60 to 2 stories up, Edmund Ashworth stood at the window of his private study with a cup of tea going cold in his hand. He'd come to the window by accident. Or told himself he had. Risen early to review the estate accounts, glanced out at the paddock out of habit the way he always did, and the moment he saw her sitting in the grass with the stallion standing over her, he stopped. He hadn't moved since. It was the hand signals that caught him. 2 fingers pressed below the ear. A slow circular motion along the jaw. Then down to the crest of the neck, 2 short presses. Too short before she stepped back and let the horse respond. Edmund knew those signals. He'd seen them exactly once before, 12 years ago. A young officer attached to the Royal Horse Artillery during a training exercise at the academy. The senior instructor, a severe, brilliant woman named Colonel Averston, had demonstrated a set of techniques she called the Old Language. Touch-based commands developed over generations by the Crown's most elite horse trainers. Used to calm battle-shocked cavalry mounts. To build a bond between rider and horse so deep the animal would walk into cannon smoke without flinching. The techniques were closely guarded. Taught only to trainers holding the rank of master or above within the royal stables. Never written down. Passed hand to hand, teacher to student within a closed circle of perhaps 20 people in the entire country. And this woman, this flower seller from a market town, was using them in his paddock as casually as if she were peeling an apple. Edmund set his tea down on the sill, his mind turning fast now over possibilities. Former groom who'd picked up fragments of the technique somewhere, unlikely, the sequences were too precise. Someone who'd copied the movements from a distance? Impossible. The pressure patterns were invisible to an observer. You had to feel them taut against your own hands to learn them properly. Which left one conclusion that made sense, and several that didn't. Edmund found himself unwilling to commit to any of them just yet. Down in the paddock, Marianne had moved to Ironclad's left side, guiding him through slow turns using nothing but her fingertips against his shoulder. Once she laughed, quiet, genuine, a sound that carried up through the still air to the open study window, and she pressed her forehead briefly against the horse's neck. Edmund watched for another long minute. Then he turned from the window, sat at his desk, pulled a sheet of writing paper toward him, uncapped his pen, paused, wrote a single line at the top of the page. "Who is Marianne Colter?" Underlined it, pen down, stared at the words. He wouldn't ask her yet. Asking too early would only produce a prepared answer. And prepared answers told you nothing worth knowing. Better to watch, better to let the truth reveal itself in the small, unguarded moments when a person forgot they were being observed. He folded the paper, tucked it into his waistcoat pocket, went downstairs to breakfast, and found he couldn't stop turning the two-finger press over in his mind, again and again, like a coin he couldn't figure out how to spend. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, had taken one look at Marianne on her first morning at the manor and drawn her own quiet conclusions. She'd seen a great many temporary guests pass through Vance Manor over her 22 years of service, visiting cousins, business associates of the old Duke, the occasional young woman brought round by hopeful mothers angling for a match that never quite materialized. She knew within an hour of meeting any of them, roughly how long they'd stay and roughly how much trouble they'd cause the household staff in the process. She hadn't known what to make of Marianne Colter at all. The girl, though girl seemed the wrong word for a woman with that particular steadiness in her eyes, carried herself like someone accustomed to hard work and modest means, and yet there was something underneath that plainness that Mrs. Whitfield's decades of service had taught her to notice. A quality of bearing. The way she held a teacup, or addressed a servant, or stood when a door opened, all of it suggesting a woman who had once moved through considerably grander rooms than a market town cottage, and had simply deliberately unlearned the habit of showing it. "She's not what she says she is," Mrs. Whitfield told the cook, on the second evening, over the washing up. "Mark my words. That one's got a history." "Everyone's got a history," the cook said, unimpressed, elbow deep in a pot that had scorched on one side. "Not the kind that makes a duke ride 2 hours out of his own way and knock on a cottage door himself, rather than sending a footman to fetch her proper missus," Whitfield said. "I've been in this house a long time, Agnes. I know the difference between a man collecting hired help and a man who's already half decided something else entirely." The cook snorted, unconvinced, but Mrs. Whitfield kept her own counsel and her own quiet observations, and found herself over the following days, taking small extra care with the tray she sent up to the guest room above the kitchen wing, an extra biscuit here, a particularly good cut of cheese there, the way a person extends small kindnesses to someone they suspect might need them more than they'd ever admit aloud. 3 days. Marianne had been at the manor 3 days, and already the estate had begun to feel less like a strange country, and more like something she was learning the shape of. Ironclad had taken to sleeping stretched flat on his side in the straw, unusual for a horse so recently moved. Most nervous animals stayed on their feet the first week, ready to bolt at any unfamiliar sound. But she'd hung a small muslin pouch of chamomile and lavender from the beam above his stall, and the scent filled the enclosed space like a gentle fog. She was proud of that, quietly. The grooms had started talking too. A young groom named Dawson leaning on his pitchfork one afternoon, watching her through the paddock fence with his mouth open like a landed trout, while he was very much supposed to be mucking out stalls. Phillips, the senior groom, mentioning at supper that Miss Colter's way with the animal was something remarkable. Remarkable. That was the word they used. She wondered sometimes, lying awake in the small guest room above the kitchen wing, whether Wexley heard that word too. Whether it reached him the way certain words reach certain men, not as praise, but as an insult wearing praise's clothing. She didn't wish him harm. She simply understood, in the specific way a person understands, a storm gathering on the horizon, that something was coming. She'd felt this before. 3 years ago, in a stable that smelled different, under a sky that hung differently over a city instead of these rolling hills. She'd felt exactly this same pressure building in a room before it broke. She didn't tell anyone that part. Not yet. The letter arrived on the 4th night, delivered by a boy from the village who'd been paid a shilling to make the 2-mile walk and not ask questions about why. Wexley read it in the tack room, by a single door bolt, the way he'd read the last 3. Marrow's hand. Unmistakable, that particular slant to the capital letters. I understand there has been a complication, the letter read. A woman, I'm told. Handling the animal with unexpected success. This changes nothing, Cormac. If anything, it raises the stakes considerably. Ashworth cannot be permitted to present a horse of this caliber, tamed by methods so unorthodox they'll be the talk of every drawing room in the county. You understand what that means for the contracts. You understand what it means for men like us, who built our reputations on methods that actually require discipline, rather than a bag of dried weeds and a woman's cooing. I trust you'll manage the situation appropriately. I needn't remind you what's owed. Wexley read it twice, then held the corner to the candle flame and watched it curl black and vanish, ash drifting down onto the tack room floor. He sat in the dark a long while after. He thought about the girl's hand on the horse's chest. The way the animal had simply stopped. Like something in him had finally been asked a question gently enough to answer honestly. Wexley had never asked a horse anything gently in his life. He'd never been taught to. He stood, blew out the candle, walked out into the dark stable corridor where the horses shifted and sighed in their sleep, and made his way toward the east wing. He stopped outside Ironclad's stall, didn't go in. Not that night. Stood there a long moment in the dark, listening to the stallion's slow, even breathing, and something in his chest twisted in a way he didn't have a name for. Not guilt exactly, a cousin of it. The kind of feeling a man learns to swallow when he's already decided what he's going to do and is simply waiting for the courage or the desperation to catch up. He turned, walked back toward the tack room, where a small glass bottle sat waiting on the shelf behind the leather oil, wrapped in a rag so it wouldn't clink against the other bottles. He hadn't touched it yet. He told himself, standing there with his hand not quite reaching for it, that he still had time to decide. He picked up the bottle, put it in his coat pocket, and went to bed, though sleep, when it finally came, brought him nothing resembling rest. Morning again, bright this time, clear skies over the valley. The mist burned off early. Marianne walked Ironclad through a full circuit of ground exercises in the training paddock, and something in the horse had shifted since the first morning, not just calmer, but present, attentive, the way an animal gets when it's decided a person is worth listening to rather than merely tolerating. She didn't notice Wexley watching from the stable door. She wouldn't have known what to make of his expression if she had. It wasn't hatred exactly. A man standing at the edge of something he'd built his whole identity around, watching it be quietly, effortlessly outdone by someone who'd learned an entirely different language for the same conversation. He turned away before she could see him, walked back into the dark of the stable, hand closing around the small glass bottle in his pocket, and didn't let himself think about the horse's slow, trusting breathing the night before. That he'd learned long ago was usually the only way through. That evening Edmund found Marianne in the tack room, cleaning a bridle with the slow, careful attention of someone who'd done this 1,000 times and never once let it become mindless. You didn't tell me, he said, from the doorway, that you spoke his language before you ever touched him. She didn't look up. I don't know what you mean, Your Grace. I think you do. Her hands stilled on the leather, just for a moment, then resumed, steady again, like nothing had happened. It's late, she said. You should be at supper. Should. He didn't move. The candlelight caught the side of her face, the line of her jaw, the careful stillness of someone holding something very tightly behind a calm expression. Good night, Miss Colter, he said finally. Good night, Your Grace. He left. Didn't look back, though he wanted to. Badly, in a way that surprised him more than he was ready to admit. Behind him in the tack room, Marianne set the bridle down and pressed both hands flat against the workbench, breathing slowly until her own hands stopped shaking. 3 years. 3 years of silence, of small rented rooms and dried flowers and a name nobody asked her to explain. And here it was again, the careful attention of a man who noticed too much. She thought about the buckle. The one she still saw sometimes, in the space just before sleep, snapped clean in a way that metal fatigue never quite explained if you knew what you were looking at. She pushed the thought down, blew out the candle, walked back to her small room above the kitchen wing where sleep came slow and thin, and somewhere below her in the dark of the stable, a man she barely knew stood outside a stall with a bottle in his pocket, telling himself, one more night, that there was still time to decide otherwise. There wasn't, though. Not really. Some decisions get made long before the hand finally moves. This one had been made 3 weeks ago in the slant of a familiar handwriting, in a debt that had never once felt like it belonged to him to forgive. The stable clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the dark, a fox, distant, and was answered by nothing. And the estate slept on, unaware that morning would bring the first crack in something that had, for 3 fragile days, looked almost like it might hold. Because the truth was, those 3 days had been the gentlest Marianne had known in longer than she cared to count. Not easy. Nothing about coaxing trust out of a traumatized animal was ever easy. But gentle, in the way a wound is gentle once the worst of the bleeding has stopped, and the body has finally been given room to begin its slow, patient work of mending. She'd noticed it herself, somewhere around the 3rd evening, sitting on an overturned bucket in the tack room, polishing a bit that didn't need polishing, simply because her hands wanted something to do while her mind wandered. She'd noticed that she was for the first time in 3 years not bracing. That was the word for it. Bracing. She'd spent 3 years bracing for the knock on the door, for the customer who recognized her from some old newspaper illustration, for the letter that never came from anyone who might have vouched for her. Bracing had become such a constant companion that she'd stopped noticing its weight, the way you stop noticing the weight of your own coat after wearing it long enough. And here, in this strange stone house with its clock tower and its red brick stables, she'd gone 3 whole days without bracing once. It frightened her a little, if she was honest. Because the last time she'd let herself feel this settled, this close to safe, the ground had opened up beneath her without warning, and swallowed everything she'd built. She thought of her grandmother sometimes, in these quiet moments. The old woman had died when Marianne was 19, long before any of this, before the royal stables, before the parade, before Ashmore, but she'd left behind a handful of sayings that Marianne still carried the way other people carried scripture. A horse that trusts too fast has never been hurt properly yet, her grandmother used to say, working dried lavender between calloused fingers. Wait for the second look, the first one's just curiosity. It's the second one that tells you the truth. Marianne had learned over the years to apply that same patience to people. She was still waiting for her second look at Edmund Ashworth. Still watching, in the quiet moments between them, for the crack that would reveal whether his interest in her methods was genuine, or merely the passing fascination of a wealthy man amused by something unusual. She hadn't found the crack yet. That worried her more than finding one would have. Wexley, for his part, spent those same 3 days in a kind of low, grinding misery that he told no one about, and that showed itself only in small things: a shorter temper with the younger grooms, a tendency to eat his meals alone rather than at the long table in the servants' hall, a habit of standing very still in doorways for far longer than any errand required. He'd served under 3 different head grooms before rising to master himself, and he'd learned from each of them a particular lesson that he now found himself unable to escape. A stable runs on trust, not sentiment. Not affection. Trust. The animals had to trust the hands that fed them. The grooms had to trust the master who commanded them. And the master turn had to trust that his own judgment, forged over decades of hard-won experience, could be relied upon when it mattered most. He had built his entire identity on the third piece of that equation. And now here he was, lying awake most nights, no longer certain his own judgment could be trusted for anything at all. Because a debt was supposed to be simple. You were given something you couldn't repay your life. In his case, dragged bodily from beneath a collapsing titillary line, and you spent the rest of your days looking for opportunities to close the gap between what you'd received and what you'd given back. That was the shape a debt was supposed to take: clean, honorable. A ledger that balanced, eventually, if you were patient and faithful enough. Nobody had ever told him what to do when the person holding the other end of that ledger asked you to do something that curdled in your stomach. The moment you understood what it actually meant, he thought, more than once during those 3 days, about simply refusing. Writing back to Marrow with a single line, "I cannot do this," and letting the consequences fall where they would. He never quite managed to write that letter either. Some men are brave enough to break a debt cleanly, in one decisive stroke, and live with whatever comes after. Wexley had never been that kind of man. And by the 4th night, standing once more in the dark of the tack room with the small glass bottle cold in his palm, he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, exactly what kind of man he actually was. The kind who did the thing he dreaded rather than face the larger dread of what refusing might cost him. He told himself it was the last time he'd have to make that choice. He was wrong about that, though he wouldn't understand how wrong for several more days yet. The morning of the 5th day started wrong. Marianne felt it before she understood it. That particular wrongness that lives in the air before anything visible happens. She woke, in the small room above the kitchen, and lay still for a moment, listening to nothing. Because that was the wrongness. Nothing: no creak of the 3rd stair, no clatter of the kitchen maids starting the fires. She dressed fast, didn't light a candle, found her way down by feel, palm trailing along the cold plaster wall, until she reached the courtyard door and stepped out into air. So still it felt like the whole valley was holding its breath along with her. 6 o'clock. The stable clock told her that much. She crossed to the east wing and stopped. Because something in her, some old animal instinct honed over 15 years of walking into stalls that housed creatures large enough to kill her without meaning to, told her to stop before she opened that door, told her something had changed in the smell coming from inside. She pushed the door open anyway. Ironclad was on his feet. Which was wrong, immediately wrong. Because he'd taken to sleeping stretched flat these past 4 nights. And now here he was standing rigid in the corner of his stall, with his ears pinned, and his eyes rolling white at the edges, exactly the way he'd looked in the square that first terrible morning. Hey, she's soft. Hey now, what's happened? He didn't come to her. That was the second wrong thing. He always came to her. 4 days of trust built one careful hour at a time, and now he stood pressed into the far corner of his own stall. Like she was a stranger walking in off the street. She moved slow, hands open, kept talking low, though her mind was already racing 3 steps ahead of her mouth, already cataloging everything that could explain this. Except it wasn't simple, because when she got close enough to run her hands along his neck, checking for injury, her fingers came away with something on them. A film. Faint. Almost invisible in the gray morning light. She lifted her fingers to her nose, and her stomach dropped straight through the floor. 2 hours later, the training paddock had become something else entirely. Marianne stood in the center of it, holding a saddle blanket in both hands like it might explain itself if she just stared at it long enough. Edmund arrived at a run, not a question. A demand, though his voice stayed level. He tried to throw me, Marianne said. Second I put weight in the stirrup, he went up. Nearly took me over backward. Are you hurt? Nothing worse. Edmund's eyes moved past her, to the horse still shaking his head, still rubbing his nose hard against his own foreleg, and something in his expression shifted from concern into a colder, sharper thing entirely. Something's wrong with him, something's wrong with his tack, she said. She held up the blanket, turned it over. And there it was, plain as anything once you knew to look, a thin, deliberate line of discoloration running along the exact stretch of wool that had rested against his withers. Edmund took it from her, held it to his face. The smell hit him immediately. Sharp. Chemical. Turpentine, unmistakable, with something deeper and more bitter underneath it. Mustard oil, Marianne said quietly, mixed with turpentine. Farriers use it sometimes on open wounds to burn away infection. Applied to a blanket like this, she didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Edmund's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped visibly beneath his ear. Who, he said. Not who did this, just the word. Flat, final, like a door closing. Marianne looked past him toward the paddock fence where the small crowd of grooms and stable hands had gathered to watch, and toward the back of that crowd, arms folded arranged into a Care-Perfection.
Wesley,
she said loud enough to carry. You retired at what hour last night? The murmuring stopped. Wexley's eyes came up, met hers across the paddock. 10 o'clock, he said. As I always do. And you saw nothing, heard nothing. I sleep soundly, Miss Colter. A man my age learns on too. Convenient, she said. Careful, he said back. Quiet. Dangerous. You're making an accusation you can't prove. I'm asking a question you haven't answered. Edmund stepped between them before either of them could say another word. Enough, he said. Both of you. His eyes moved to Wexley, held there a beat longer than was comfortable. We will discuss this in private. Wexley, return to your duties, Miss Colter, see to the horse. Wexley gave a short nod, turned, walked back toward the stable block without another word, his stride unhurried, his back straight. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He'd planted the seed. He'd survived the confrontation, and they both knew it. Marianne spent the rest of the morning tending Ironclad's skin. Cool water first, washing the chemical residue from his nose and withers, murmuring the whole time in that low steady tone that had become the only language he seemed to trust completely. Then a poultice of her own making, crushed comfrey leaves mixed with beeswax, a few drops of calendula oil pressed gently against the raw reddened patches. He stood quietly through all of it, drowsy by the end, leaning his great head down over her shoulder in a way that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She checked every piece of his remaining tack afterward, piece by piece, sniffing every strap, every buckle. Then she cleaned and rehung each item herself, memorizing their exact positions on the rail. She didn't cry. She'd been furious and frightened for the horse, and something else underneath both of those that she didn't examine too closely, because examining it meant admitting how much of her old life had come rushing back the moment she smelled turpentine on wool. She'd smelled it before. Not this exact combination, but the principle. The same cold, calculated cruelty dressed up as coincidence. She knew precisely where to look. She'd learned it the hard way 3 years ago in a stable yard she still saw sometimes in the space just before sleep. The summons came at 7:30 that evening. Colton delivered it with the kind of careful politeness that suggested he already knew the conversation ahead would be an uncomfortable one. His Grace requests your presence in the study, Miss Colter. At your earliest convenience. The study was warm, a coal fire burning low in the grate. Walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A large oak, and behind it, Edmund Ashworth. Coat removed, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, 2 glasses of brandy already poured. He gestured to the chair opposite. She sat. How is the horse? He asked. The blistering will heal in a few days. I've dressed both areas. He was calm when I left him. Edmund nodded. Pushed one of the glasses toward her. She looked at it a moment, then picked it up. I want to ask you something, Miss Colter. A pause. And I would appreciate a direct answer. Then ask a direct question. He leaned back, studied her across the desk, firelight carving deep shadows beneath his cheekbones. This morning, before the incident with the tack, I watched you work with him in the training paddock yesterday. Hand signals. Pressure patterns applied below the ear. Along the crest of the neck. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. A circular motion along the jaw, a 2-finger press at the pole. He paused this time. I've seen those signal exactly once before. Marianne's hand tightened, just slightly, around the brandy glass. Her face stayed perfectly still. 12 years ago, Edmund continued, at the Royal Horse Artillery Training Grounds. Demonstrated by a woman named Colonel Averston, as part of an advanced program restricted to senior military trainers. The techniques were never published. Never taught outside the program. The number of people in England who know them could fit comfortably in this room. He leaned forward. So my question, Miss Colter, is a simple one. Where did you learn them? The fire crackled in the silence that followed. She could lie. She'd been lying for 3 years. Lying by omission. Lying by silence, letting everyone she was exactly what she appeared to be. A common woman with an uncommon touch. But Edmund's eyes were steady on hers. And she recognized in them something she hadn't expected to find. Not suspicion. Something closer to patience. The look of a man who already suspected the answer and was simply waiting for her to trust him enough to say it out loud. I didn't learn them from a book, she said finally. Right. And I didn't learn them by watching someone through a fence. No, Edmund said. I didn't imagine you did. Marianne drew a slow breath. My name is Marianne Colter, she said. That part is true. But before I came to Ashmore, before I sold flowers, before any of this started again, I held the rank of head trainer at the Crown's Central Stables. Edmund's expression didn't change, which told her he'd already suspected something close to this. He waited and let her keep talking. I served under Colonel Averston 6 years. She selected me personally from a group of 40 candidates when I was 22.
I completed the full training program.
The old language. Preparage. Ceremonial handling. By 26, I held the highest civilian training rank in the royal stables. I was responsible for preparing horses for state processions, diplomatic events, military reviews. She paused. 3 years ago, during a state parade through the capital, one of the horses I'd prepared a great gelding suffered a catastrophic tack failure mid-procession. The girth buckle snapped mid-stride. The rider was thrown in front of a crowd of several thousand people. A breath. He survived, thank God. But his arm was broken in 2 places, and the embarrassment to the crown was considerable. And you were blamed, Edmund said. Not a question. I was responsible for the final inspection of all ceremonial tack before every event. The buckle that failed had been signed off under my name. Her jaw tightened. The investigation concluded I'd missed a critical defect in the metalwork. I was stripped of my rank, dismissed from service, barred from any future association with the Crown stables. Had you missed it? Marianne's gray eyes met his across the desk, steady, unflinching. That buckle wasn't sound when I inspected it the night before the parade. When I examined the broken buckle after the incident, the fracture pattern was wrong. Metal that fails from fatigue breaks differently than metal that's been scored deliberately with a file and weakened on purpose. She exhaled slowly. I tried to present my findings to the review board, but by then the decision had already been made. They needed someone to hold accountable, and I was the convenient choice. You believed the buckle was. I know it was, she said. I simply couldn't prove it then, and I cannot prove it now. The evidence was collected and sealed by military authority. I was given no access to it after my dismissal. The fire had burned down to deep orange coals. Edmund sat in silence, turning her words over. You understand, he said slowly, that what happened to Ironclad this morning bears a striking resemblance to what you've just described. Tack that was sound the night before. Found tampered the next day. A rider put in danger. The person responsible hiding behind a lack of evidence. Yes, Marianne said. I noticed for his brandy. Drained it. Set the glass down with a quiet click. I have a proposition for you, he said. I need this horse rideable within a fortnight. I've committed to presenting him at a gathering at a neighboring estate, and I will not arrive with an animal I cannot control. Help me ride him successfully at that gathering. And in return, I will use every connection I have to reopen the inquiry into the Westminster failure. I know members of the original review board personally. I sit on the advisory council for military horse procurement. I can get you access to the sealed evidence. Marianne stared at him. For the first time since she'd arrived at the manor, her composure cracked. Just slightly. Something raw and desperate flickering across her face before she pulled it back under control. You would do that, I would, on one condition. Name it. No more secrets between us, Miss Colter. His eyes held hers, steady. If you suspect Wexley, tell me directly. If you see further tampering, bring it to me immediately, and if there's anything else as about your past I should know, I'd rather hear it now than discover it later. Marianne nodded once. You have my word. Good. Edmund stood. Extended his hand across the desk. Then we have an agreement. She took it. His grip was firm and dry, and he held it a moment longer than strictly necessary before letting go, and neither of them mentioned it, though both of them noticed. Get some rest, Miss Colter. We have 10 days before the gathering, and I intend to ride that horse across the finish line if it's the last thing I do. She rose to leave, then paused at the door, her hand resting against the frame the way his had once rested against her cottage door weeks and a lifetime ago. May I ask you something in return, she said. Of course. Why does it matter to you so much? Not the horse, understand, the horse, the money already spent. I mean the rest of it, the inquiry. My rank. You've known me a fortnight, Your Grace. Most men in your position would consider the horse problem solved and leave the rest of my history well alone, particularly once it became clear how tangled and inconvenient the rest of my history actually was. Edmund considered the question for a long moment, turning his empty brandy glass slowly between his fingers. My father, he said finally, believed that a man's worth was measured entirely by what he controlled: land, horses, the obedience of everyone beneath him. I was raised inside that belief the way a fish is raised inside water, so thoroughly surrounded by it that I didn't recognize it as a philosophy at all. I simply thought it was how the world worked. And now you think otherwise. I think, Edmund said slowly, that I watched a woman walk toward the most dangerous animal I have ever owned, carrying nothing but a handful of dead flowers, and succeed where 4 experienced men with ropes and force had failed entirely. And I have spent every day since trying to understand what that actually means, because it doesn't fit inside anything my father ever taught me about how power is supposed to work. He set the glass down. You didn't control that horse, Miss Colter. You didn't dominate him into submission. You asked him something gently, and waited for an honest answer, and he gave you one. That is not a method my father would have recognized as effective. And yet I have never in my life seen anything work so well. So this is about horses then. Purely academic curiosity about training methods. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow. I said it began there. And where does it end? I find I don't yet know, Edmund said honestly. I only know that a woman who was wronged 3 years ago, in a manner strikingly similar to how you were nearly wronged again this very week, deserves to have that wrong corrected. Whatever else may or may not develop between us, Miss Colter, that much I intend to see through regardless. Marianne studied him a long moment, weighing the careful honesty of the answer against every instinct that had kept her safe. These past 3 years, the instinct that trust was a luxury afforded to people who hadn't yet learned what happened when you extended it to the wrong person. That's a fair answer, she said finally. Was it the answer you expected? No, she admitted. I expected something considerably more self-serving. Or considerably more romantic. This was neither entirely, and somehow that makes it easier to believe. I find myself, more and more these days, disinclined toward either extreme. Edmund's self-interest and romance both tend to distort a person's judgment in ways that eventually cost someone dearly. I'd rather simply do what seems right, and let whatever else develops between us develop on its own honest timeline, without either of us forcing it towards some predetermined shape. She nodded slowly. Something in her chest had loosened further during this conversation, some knot she hadn't fully realized. she was still carrying from the moment she'd first stepped through his study door. "Good night, Your Grace." "Edmund," he said. "When we're alone at least. I find Your Grace grows tiresome from people I've come to genuinely respect." "Good night then, Edmund." The name sat strangely in her mouth, unfamiliar and warm at once, and she carried the strangeness of it with her all the way back to her small room above the kitchen wing, turning it over like a stone worn smooth by a river, wondering how something so simple could feel like the beginning of something considerably larger than either of them had yet found the courage to name. She didn't go straight to bed. She walked out into the courtyard instead, into the cold night air, and stood there a long while looking up at the stars, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in 3 years. Not relief exactly. Something closer to hope, which was a dangerous thing to feel, because hope had a way of making the eventual fall hurt worse than the original wound ever had. She thought about Colonel Averston, wondered if the old woman still remembered her name, except she hadn't missed it. She said the words silently, the way she'd said them to herself 1,000 nights in a row, and for the first time in 3 years, saying them didn't feel like screaming into an empty room. Someone had finally offered to listen. 3 doors down in a room above the tack room, Cormac Wexley lay awake on his narrow bed with his hands folded over his chest like a man laid out for his own funeral. He'd heard some of it, not all. But he'd caught the shape of the conversation secondhand, the way servants always caught the shape of things, that Miss Colter had been in the study a long while, that something about a broken buckle and a state parade had drifted through the gap under the door. He turned the pieces over in his mind. A woman stripped of rank 3 years ago, blamed for something she claimed she hadn't done. A sabotaged buckle that broke wrong, if you knew what wrong looked like. His stomach turned over. Because he did know what wrong looked like. He'd learned once long ago exactly what a deliberately weakened strap looked like when it finally gave. He sat up in the dark, told himself he was being foolish, told himself the parallel meant an except the timing, except the rank she'd claimed to hold, except the very specific, very particular signature of a strap weakened just enough to hold through inspection and fail exactly when it mattered most. Wexley had learned that method from exactly one man in his entire life. He put his head in his hands and sat like that a long while, in the dark, in the silence, while somewhere below him a horse he'd deliberately hurt slept peacefully under a poultice made by the hands of a woman he was beginning, despite every instinct telling him not to suspect might have been telling him the truth about a great many things. Morning brought no answers, only more questions, and a letter Wexley didn't write, though he sat at the small desk in his room for the better part of an hour with a pen in his hand and the paper blank in front of him. He couldn't do it. He set the pen down, left the paper blank, told himself there'd be time enough later to decide what to do with what he was starting to know. The days that followed took on a strange, careful rhythm. Marianne worked the horse every morning, patient, methodical, watching him regain the trust he'd lost, and by the 6th day he was standing quietly for saddling again, ears forward, breathing even, though she noticed and made certain Edmund noticed too, that she now checked every strap twice before allowing anyone else within 10 feet of the tack room. Young Dawson had taken to lingering near the paddock most mornings now, ostensibly on some errand or other that always seemed to require exactly the amount of time it took Marianne to finish a session with Ironclad. She let it continue for the better part of a week, before finally addressing it directly. "You're meant to be mucking the west stalls, I believe," she said, not looking up from the girth she was inspecting. Dawson flushed red to the tips of his ears. "Yes, Miss Colter. And yet, I finished them early." A pause. "Miss Colter, might I ask you something?" She straightened. Studied the boy a moment. 16, gangly in the way boys that age always were, clearly torn between the fear of overstepping and the desperate curiosity of someone who'd watched something extraordinary happen and couldn't stop wondering how. "Ask. How do you know?" He said what he's thinking. "The horse. Everyone says you talk to him like he understands you, but he's an animal, isn't he?" "He can't understand words." Marianne considered the question with more seriousness than the boy likely expected. "He doesn't understand words," she agreed. "Not the way you and I do. But he understands everything else. About how you say them. The pitch of your voice, the steadiness of your breathing. Whether your hands are asking something of him or demanding it." She set down the girth. "Most people, when they're frightened or angry, their whole body changes without them realizing it. Shoulders go tight. Breathing goes shallow and fast. Voice climbs half an octave without permission. A horse notices all of that before you've said a single word, because a horse has spent his whole life needing to notice things like that to survive. Predators move fast and breathe hard right before they strike. A horse who can't tell the difference between a frightened stable hand and an actual predator doesn't live very long in the wild. So you just stay calm. I stay calm. On purpose, she corrected. It's not the same thing as simply being calm. Some days I'm furious or frightened or heartbroken over something that has nothing to do with any horse at all. But I've trained myself, the same way I train them, to keep my breathing slow and my hands steady regardless of what's happening underneath. It's a kind of performance if you want to call it that. Except the audience can smell a false performance from 50 yards, so it has to be real underneath, even when it's difficult. Dawson turned this over for a long moment, his young face working through something more complicated than his years quite had the vocabulary for yet. Could anyone learn it? He asked finally. Or does it have to be, I don't know, a gift, something you're born with? Anyone with enough patience and enough willingness to fail badly over and over before they start succeeding. She allowed herself a small smile. I've burned my share of horses' trust before I learned how not to, Dawson. Nobody starts out good at this, they start out clumsy and eager, and occasionally reckless, same as you'd start out clumsy at anything worth doing well eventually. Would you teach me? The question came out in a rush, like he'd been holding it back for days, and finally lost the will to keep containing it. Not instead of my regular work, just in whatever time's left over. Marianne studied him a long moment. She thought of her own beginning 22 years old, selected from 40 candidates by a woman who saw something in her nobody else had bothered to look for. A debt of opportunity she'd never quite managed to repay before it was all taken away from her in a single unjust inquiry. She thought about how strange it was, the way a gift like this only survived by being passed forward, hand to hand, generation to generation, refusing to die out even when the people who carried it were cast aside by the institutions meant to protect. Come by the paddock an hour before your regular duties begin, she said finally. I won't go easy on you simply because you're young and eager. But I'll teach you. If you're willing to put in the work, most people aren't patient enough to finish. Dawson's face lit up in a way that made him look for a moment considerably younger than 16. Thank you, Miss Colter, I won't disappoint you. See that you don't, she said, though there was no real sternness in it, and something in her chest warmed at the sight of him practically running back toward the stable block, eager to spread news of his good fortune to anyone who'd listen. Phillips, watching the exchange from a respectful distance, allowed himself a small knowing smile. You've made that boy's entire season, Miss Colter, he said, once Dawson was out of earshot. He'll work hard for it, Marianne said. I could see that much already. Aye, he will. Phillips considered her a moment, weathered face, thoughtful. It's a fine thing you're building here. Whatever else happens with Wexley, whatever comes of all this business, you've already changed how this stable thinks about handling. The younger grooms watch you the way I imagine young soldiers watch a general who's actually won a battle instead of just reading about them in books. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness. It's simple fact. He touched his cap, an old habit of respect that predated any of the recent upheaval. 19 years would place on discipline and force, and horses feared him even when they obeyed him. You've been here a fortnight, and already half the stable would follow you into a burning barn if you asked them to. That's not a small thing, Miss Colter. Whatever you decide to do with it. Edmund began joining her some mornings. I won't get in your way, he said. You're already in my way, she said. But there was no heat in it, and something at the corner of her mouth suggested she didn't entirely mind. You're staring, she told him once, not looking up from Ironclad's hoof, which she was cleaning with careful practiced hands. I'm observing. Is there a difference? There's supposed to be, she almost smiled, almost. He caught it before she could smooth it away. Wexley watched too. From doorways and shadowed corners he saw the way the Duke lingered at that fence. Saw it, and understood immediately what it meant, and felt something cold settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with horses or letters or old war debts. Because if Ashworth's affections were becoming entangled with the woman, then whatever happened to her next wouldn't stay contained to a stable dispute. It would become something else entirely. He thought about writing to Merrow, warning him. He didn't. The 7th night he sat again in the dark of the tack room, the small glass bottle in his coat pocket, though this time it wasn't liniment, a pocket knife. Good steel. The kind every stableman in the country carried for 100 daily tasks, and the kind that, in the wrong hands, could turn a girth strap into something that would fail catastrophically at the wrong moment. He held the knife in his palm a long while. Told himself the same story he'd told himself the first night. He almost bespit. Except somewhere underneath the story he was telling himself, a smaller, quieter voice kept asking a question he didn't have a good answer for. What if she isn't wrong? What if you're about to become the second man in her life to do to her exactly what was done to her once already? He put the knife back in his pocket, didn't use it that night. Told himself it was because the timing wasn't right yet. He knew even as he told himself that it was a lie, a small one. A postponement rather than a decision. The 10th morning arrived with frost on the grass and a letter under Wexley's door that he hadn't sent for. Not Merrow's hand this time. A man Wexley had served alongside briefly years ago, now working as a clerk attached to the same military review board that had ended Marianne's career. The letter was brief. Thought you should know, Cormac. There's a rumor going round certain circles that the Colter matter wasn't as clean as the official record suggests. A junior officer on the review panel raised concerns at the time about the fracture pattern, concerns that were never properly addressed. He was quietly reassigned shortly after raising them. Wexley read it 3 times. Then sat very still in the gray morning light, the letter shaking slightly in his hand. A junior officer reassigned for raising concerns. He thought about the man he'd known Aldous Merrow to be 32 years ago on a battlefield thick with smoke and screaming horses. Decisive. A man who protected the men under his command with a ferocity Wexley had never forgotten. He'd never once considered that the same ferocity might, in a different decade, be turned toward protecting something less noble. His own career, his own reputation, his own contracts. Wexley folded the letter, didn't burn this one. Marianne noticed the change in him before she understood what had caused it. He'd stopped watching from doorways. And when their paths did cross, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Masters Wexley, she said, catching him one afternoon in the tack room, both of them reaching for the same hook at the same moment. May I ask you something? His hand withdrew first. You may ask. I make no promise of an answer. Fair enough. She studied him a moment. You served in the artillery years ago. Something flickered across his face. Quick. Who told you that? Nobody told me. The way you stand when a horse rears, I've seen it before, in men who trained cavalry mounts for the crown. Wexley was quiet a long moment. You held rank then, he said. Before all this, before flowers, I did high rank. Highest for a civilian trainer in the royal stables. His jaw worked. And you lost it. I was made to lose it, she said. Careful. There's a difference, is there? There is if you were the one it happened to, the buckle. The one that failed Westminster. His voice had got suspect. No. Marianne's breath cut just slightly. I have a suspicion, she said. I've never had proof. A man with connections to the review board. A man who had every reason to want the inquiry to end quickly, quietly, with someone else's name attached to the blame instead of his own decisions. I don't know his name, not for certain, only that he was there the night before the parade in the stables in a place he had no official reason to be. He wore a ring. Gold. Carved with a hawk.
Oh.
Wexley's face had gone very still. Master Wexley, she said. Are you unwell? No, he said finally, rough. I don't believe I am. He set the bridle down. Walked out of the tack room without another word. That night Wexley didn't sleep at all. Because he could see it now. Could see it with the particular, sickening clarity of a man who's spent decades refusing to look directly at something and has finally, involuntarily, been forced. Merrow had done this before. And he'd nearly done it a second time. Had come within a single decision of destroying the same woman twice in service of the same debt, the same misplaced loyalty. He almost told her the next morning. Stood at the paddock fence with the words forming behind his teeth, and got as far as opening his mouth before something stopped him. Fear. Mostly. Fear of what it would mean, saying it out loud. Fear of what Merrow would do. Fear too of a smaller, more selfish thing that confessing meant admitting what he'd already done. The liniment. The blistered skin on an animal that had trusted him, briefly, before he'd betrayed that trust for a debt that was starting to look less and less like honor, and more like a chain fastened around his own neck decades ago, and never once unlocked. He closed his mouth, walked away from the fence without a word. She had bigger concerns. The gathering was 4 days away now, and Ironclad, though healing well, still carried a faint nervousness around anything touching his back. Small setbacks manageable but real. 3 days before the gathering, a rider arrived from the neighboring estate carrying formal correspondence details of the event, a guest list, and among the names on that list, buried halfway down a page, Edmund read over breakfast without particular attention, was one that would have meant nothing to him a fortnight ago. Aldous Merrow. The letter noted. Formerly attached to the Advisory Council on Military Horse Procurement. Edmund read the name twice, set the letter down, and felt without yet understanding why a small cold unease settled into his chest. He didn't mention it to Marianne that morning. He would understand, soon enough. But not yet. Not for 3 more days. Not until a bridge over a shallow river and a severed girth strap forced the understanding on him whether he was ready for it or not. The gathering was 3 days away. None of them yet knew how close that gathering would come to ending everything. The household, meanwhile, had begun to notice things. Servants always noticed things. It was Marianne had come to understand during her weeks at the manor. One of the immutable laws of any great house, that the people who cooked the meals and cleaned the grates and carried the letters saw more of a household's true shape than the family who lived inside it ever imagined. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, had said nothing directly, but she'd taken to setting aside small kindnesses for Marianne with a regularity that felt deliberate. An extra log for the small grate in her room. A particularly good cut of the Sunday joint, quietly delivered rather than announced. A dress, unasked for, laid across the foot of her bed one afternoon with no note attached, as though it had simply appeared there of its own accord. Marianne understood the dress for what it was. A message, delivered in the only language a housekeeper had available to her. Someone in this house believes you belong here. Someone in this house is watching and approves of what she sees. She hadn't worn it yet. She kept it folded in the small chest at the foot of her bed, and some nights she opened the chest simply to look at it, the way a person might look at a door they weren't yet ready to walk through. Phillips, the senior groom, had become something like an ally in the days following the sabotage, not through any grand gesture, but through the accumulation of small practical loyalties. He'd taken to double-checking the stable's outer doors each night without being asked, a habit Marianne noticed but didn't remark upon, because remarking upon it would have made it a formal arrangement rather than the quiet, unspoken understanding it currently was. Young Dawson had appointed himself her unofficial shadow whenever Wexley was anywhere in sight, finding reasons to linger near the East Wing stalls that had nothing to do with his actual duties and everything to do with a 16-year-old's simple, uncomplicated sense of justice. Nobody accused Wexley outright in those days. Nobody had proof enough to justify it, and Edmund had made clear in the aftermath of the confrontation in the paddock that accusations without evidence would not be tolerated from anyone on his staff, however strongly they might feel. But the temperature of the household had shifted all the same. Wexley ate alone now, always. Conversations quieted when he entered a room and resumed carefully only after he'd left it. He had built, over 19 years, a particular kind of authority in this place respected, if not always warmly regarded, and Marianne watched that authority erode a little more each day, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of small withdrawals. A groom who no longer sought his approval before making a minor decision. A farrier who addressed his questions to Phillips instead, as though Wexley had already quietly stopped being the man whose word carried final weight. She felt, watching this happen, a complicated tangle of feelings she didn't examine too closely. Satisfaction, certainly the particular satisfaction of watching a man who had tried to hurt something in her care lose the ground beneath his own feet. But something else too. Something closer to pity that surprised her every time it surfaced, because pity was not an emotion she'd expected to feel toward Cormac Wexley, and yet there it was, stubborn and inconvenient, refusing to be reasoned away. She mentioned none of this to Edmund. Some things, she was learning, were hers alone to carry, at least for now. Edmund, for his part, had begun spending more of his evenings in her company than either strict propriety or simple practicality required, and both of them had noticed this without either of them saying so directly. "You could take supper in the main hall," Marianne told him one evening, finding him once again at the paddock fence long after the light had gone. "It's what a duke's meant to do, I'd imagine. Sit at the head of a very long table and be admired by portraits of his ancestors." "The portraits are terrible company," Edmund said. "My grandfather in particular. He glowers, even in oil paint the man glowers. And I'm better company than a glowering portrait. Considerably." He said it simply, without the practiced charm she might have expected from a man of his position, and something in the plainness of it landed harder than any polished compliment could have. "Though I'll admit the horse helps. Watching him settle each evening is the closest thing to peace I've found on this estate in some years." "You didn't find peace here before?" Edmund was quiet a moment, considering the question with more care than she'd expected. "My father built this place into something formidable," he said finally. "Cattle, horses, land holdings across 3 counties. He was a man who measured his own worth by the size of what he'd accumulated, and he raised me to measure mine the same way." A pause. "I've spent most of my adult life managing what he built, rather than living inside it. There's a difference I've come to understand, though it took me longer than it should have to see it. And now? Now I find myself standing at a fence most evenings, Watching a horse that terrified an entire town learn to trust a woman who sells flowers for a living, and finding that this precisely feels more like the life I'd have chosen for myself, if anyone had ever thought to ask me what I wanted, rather than what I was meant to inherit. Marianne said nothing for a long moment. That's a dangerous thing to admit to someone you've known 3 weeks, she said finally. Is it? Most men in his position wouldn't admit it at all. Most men in my position haven't watched what I've watched, Edmund said. You didn't just tame a horse in that market square, Miss Colter. You reminded me that there are other ways to hold power than gripping it until your knuckles go white. I'd forgotten that was possible. I'm not entirely sure I want to forget it again. She didn't have an answer for that. Not one she trusted herself to say aloud, at least. Standing in the cold evening air with a man whose good opinion had started to matter to her, more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. So she said nothing. And he let the silence stand between them. Comfortable rather than awkward. The particular kind of silence that only exists between two people who have decided, without discussing it, that they don't need to fill every quiet moment with words. It was Ironclad who finally broke it, ambling over to press his great head against the fence rail between them, ears forward, clearly unbothered by the fact that neither human currently had an apple to offer him. Edmund laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind Marianne hadn't heard from him before. He has a talent for timing, Edmund said. He has a talent for apples, Marianne corrected, reaching into her satchel out of long habit, though she knew even before checking that it was empty. Sorry, old friend, nothing tonight. Ironclad huffed, unimpressed, and turned his great head to nose instead at Edmund's coat pocket. Hopeful. And Edmund laughed again, and for one unguarded moment the three of them stood together at that fence in the deepening dark. A duke, a disgraced trainer selling flowers under a false modesty, and a warhorse who had against every expectation decided to trust them both, and nothing at all felt broken. It wouldn't last, of course. Nothing that gentle ever did. Not for people who'd already learned the hard way how quickly a good thing could be taken from them. But for that one evening, standing at a paddock fence in the last of the autumn light, it was enough simply to let the peace exist unquestioned, for as long as it chose to stay. They departed at dawn, 3 days after the letter naming Marrow had arrived, when the mist was still thick in the valley, and the grass held enough frost to soak a boot through before breakfast. Edmund rode his own bay hunter Copper. Marianne rode a chestnut mare called Birch, calm, sensible, chosen for her by the head groom with more care than she'd expected. Behind them a light carriage, Colton inside with the luggage. Young Dawson driving, practically vibrating with excitement, and behind the carriage tied to a long lead held by Phillips, the senior groom. Ironclad. Walking, just walking, which still felt like a small miracle every single time Marianne watched him do it without a fight. The last member of the party rode at the rear, a deliberate distance behind the rest, because Cormac Wexley had not been invited to this journey. He'd been ordered. You'll accompany us to the gathering, Wexley. A full stable delegation is expected. Wexley's had accepted with a short bow, said nothing further. Inside his own head, though, nothing was quiet at all, because he'd read that clerk's letter 40 times now, until the paper had gone soft at the folds and the ink had started to blur. He'd made of it everything, every possible terrible thing a man could make of 3 sentences, confirming that the person he'd spent 32 years honoring with unquestioning loyalty had once destroyed an innocent woman's entire life to protect his own reputation, and was about to do it again, except this time Wexley himself was the knife. Because if he confessed now, everything unraveled, his employment gone, his reputation gone. Except if he didn't confess and Marrow's plan succeeded a second time, he'd have to live the rest of his life knowing exactly what he'd let happen. Which was worse, he genuinely didn't know anymore. He rode on. Told himself there'd be time to decide later. Because he remembered the day he'd met Aldous Marrow with a clarity that 32 years hadn't managed to dull, no matter how much he sometimes wished it had. He'd been young then, 26, and certain of very little except how to hold a picket line, and how to keep frightened horses from bolting into gunfire, which was its own terrible way, not so very different from what he did now, except the stakes back then had been measured in human lives rather than a duke's reputation. The picket had collapsed under artillery fire nobody had anticipated. He remembered the particular quality of the sound before he remembered anything else, a deep, splitting crack that seemed to come from inside his own skull, rather than from anywhere external, and then the ground itself heaving upward beneath him, and then nothing at all for what felt like a very long time, though he'd been told later it could only have been seconds. He'd woken to smoke and screaming horses, mostly though men too, tangled together in a confusion of collapsed timber and churned mud, that made it nearly impossible to tell where the animals ended and the soldiers began. His own leg had been pinned beneath something heavy. He remembered with the strange clarity that trauma sometimes gifted a person, thinking with perfect calm that he was almost certainly about to die, and finding in that calm certainty an odd sort of peace he'd never quite managed to explain to anyone since. And then a hand had closed around his collar. Marrow hadn't been an officer of particularly high rank at that point in his career, a captain, still climbing, still building the reputation that would eventually carry him into rooms far above his original station. But he'd been decisive in a way that saved lives that day, decisive in a way Wexley had never forgotten, dragging him 50 yards through smoke and mud and the screaming chaos of dying horses with a strength that seemed, in the moment, almost impossible for one man to summon alone. Wexley had asked him later, once the worst of the shock had passed and they were both patched up and breathing, why he'd bothered. There'd been a dozen other men closer to safety, a dozen other soldiers Marrow could have reasonably prioritized over as a stable hand he barely knew. Marrow had looked at him with an expression Wexley had spent 3 decades trying to properly interpret, and had said only because you were the one I could reach. It had seemed at the time like the most profound thing anyone had ever said to him. A statement of pure, unadorned duty. You do what you can, for whoever you can reach, and you don't overthink the arithmetic of who deserves it more. He understood now, riding through frost-heavy hedgerows with a knife in his coat pocket and a letter he'd read 50 times folded soft at its creases, that he'd built an entire moral architecture on top of 6 simple words spoken by a exhausted, adrenaline-flooded young officer who likely hadn't meant anything nearly so profound by them at all. Marrow had reached for him because he was close. Nothing more complicated than that. And Wexley had spent 32 years transforming that simple physical proximity into something resembling destiny. Something that demanded repayment measured not in ordinary gratitude but in blind, unquestioning obedience, regardless of what was eventually asked of him. He wondered now whether Marrow even remembered the moment the same way. Whether the man who'd once dragged a wounded stable hand through artillery smoke had any conscious memory left of that particular act of courage, or whether it had simply dissolved, over 3 decades of accumulating power and reputation and contracts, into just another unremarkable Tuesday in a long career built increasingly on convenience rather than conviction. He didn't know. He rode on watching the frost-heavy hedgerows slide past, and somewhere around the 2nd mile his mind did the thing it had been doing for 4 straight nights now, spiraling, fast, ungovernable, a runaway cart with no brake he could find. The road wound through open farmland, past stone walls silvered with frost, past thatched cottages. By mid-morning the farmland gave way to forest. The old forest road cut through woodlands so dense, the oak and beech branches wove together overhead like the vaultings of some green cathedral nobody had bothered to build a roof for. The road narrowed as it climbed into the hills. On the left the ground dropped sharply through the trees to a rocky stream 30 feet below. Marianne fell back to ride alongside Ironclad, took the lead rope from Phillips herself, because this was the moment. This was the terrain that would tell her, better than any paddock ever could, whether the trust she'd rebuilt was real. "Steady," she murmured, hand resting light on his neck. "Just a bit of hill, nothing to fuss about." His hooves found the uneven ground with surprising care. Each step deliberate. Ahead of them Edmund had stopped Copper and turned in his saddle to watch. What he saw made him go very still. Ironclad was moving through the hardest terrain of the entire journey with the composure of a seasoned trail horse. A pheasant burst from the bracken 3 feet from his head. The stallion startled sideways and settled the instant Marianne's hand touched his shoulder. The grooms noticed. Dawson kept stealing glances back with undisguised, open admiration. Phillips shook his head slowly and muttered the word extraordinary. At the rear Wexley watched too, said nothing. His jaw moved in a slow, rhythmic clench that had nothing to do with chewing and everything to do with the war being fought inside his own chest. They crested the pass, began the long descent. Thornfield in the distance, pale stone catching afternoon light. Edmund had watched the whole crossing with something building in his chest that he didn't have an easy name for, because he'd seen brave men before. He'd commanded soldiers, in his younger years during a brief and largely uneventful stint with a militia regiment that his father had insisted upon as proper preparation for eventual title and land. He knew what courage looked like in a man who'd been trained his whole life to expect it of himself, the set jaw, the deliberate steadiness, the particular performance of fearlessness that experienced men learned to project even when their stomachs were in knots. What he'd just watched Marianne do was something else entirely. Not performed courage. Something quieter, and he was beginning to understand. Considerably rarer the courage of complete, unhurried attention. The willingness to notice exactly what a frightened creature needed in any given moment and provide precisely that without drama, without any apparent awareness that what she was doing might look, to an outside observer, like something close to miraculous. He found himself not for the first time these past weeks, wondering what her life might have looked like if the review board 3 years ago had simply done its job properly. If someone had bothered to examine that fracture pattern with the same careful attention she brought to every strap and buckle she handled, she would likely still hold her old rank, he suspected. Would likely be training horses for state processions and diplomatic events right now, her name known and respected throughout the capital, rather than hidden away in a market town selling herbs to housewives who had no idea what talent stood behind their flower stall. The unfairness of it sat uneasily alongside something else, something he was slower to name, even to himself, a small selfish gratitude that the injustice had happened at all, because without it she would never have come to Ashmore, would never have stood in that market square with a handful of dried lavender, would never have walked into his life at all. He didn't like that thought much when he examined it honestly. It felt like profiting from someone else's suffering, however indirectly, and he'd been raised to believe that a man of honor didn't allow himself comfortable thoughts built on another person's pain. But there it was regardless, stubborn and undeniable, and he found he couldn't quite talk himself out of it no matter how he tried. Edmund fell back to ride beside Marianne. That was impressive, he said. He did the work, Marianne said. I just stayed out of his way. You do yourself a disservice, Miss Colter. He chose to trust you today. That's his achievement. All I watched you do was make sure nobody gave him a reason to change his mind. Marianne studied him a moment, then smiled. We arrive within the hour, he said, clearing his throat, glancing away first. Marianne watched him go, then turned to check on Ironclad, who was watching her with dark, intelligent eyes. By them both, Wexley's eyes moved slowly, horsewoman Duke riding ahead, and his expression settled into something quiet and final. Tomorrow was the showcase. Tomorrow was his last chance to choose. Thornfield's guest stables were quieter than the manors. Wexley claimed a small room at the far end of the corridor, away from the others. He needed privacy for what he was about to do. He lay in the dark for hours, listened until he was certain the building had settled fully into sleep. He dressed in the dark, reached into his traveling bag, took out his pocket knife and a small tin of leather oil, which he rubbed across the blade in a thin, even coat. A practical habit, he told himself. He went downstairs, crossed the yard to Ironclad's stall. The stallion was awake, his great head turned toward the door, ears going flat. He stopped at the stall door, then reached over the half door to the tack rail. He didn't touch the bridle this time. That trick wouldn't work twice on a woman who checked every strap of leather by smell. This time, he went for the girth. The main girth was a wide band of double-stitched leather that buckled beneath the horse's belly and held the saddle in place through everything. The single most critical piece of tack on any riding horse. On a horse at walking pace, a girth failure was missing. On a horse at full gallop, it could be fatal. He lifted the girth from the rail, found the main buckle. He opened his knife, began to cut, working carefully, severing the stitching threads one at a time, underneath the buckle plate, where the cuts would stay invisible. He left 4 threads intact out of the original 16, enough to hold through saddling, through mounting, through a walk, even a gentle trot. But under the strain of a hard gallop, those 4 remaining threads would snap like cobwebs in a strong wind. He counted his cuts twice, folded the knife, rehung the girth exactly as he'd found it. He was back in his room within 8 minutes, sat on the edge of his narrow bed, stared at his own hands in the dark like they belonged to somebody else entirely. Because here was the terrible thing. He'd done it. Actually done it. Not talked himself into doing it, simply gone and done it. Hands moving with the same cold efficiency they'd have used on any other piece of routine stable work. He'd told himself for 4 days that he was still deciding. He hadn't been deciding anything. He'd already decided the night the first letter arrived, 3 weeks ago, and every hour since had just been the slow, cowardly performance of a man pretending he still had a choice left to make. Which meant tomorrow, if the girth gave way at the gallop, if Edmund Ashworth went down that rocky bank into the river below, he couldn't finish the thought. Sat with his head in his hands instead, and did not sleep at all that night. Not one single minute of it. The clock in the stable tower struck 2. Then somewhere outside the river kept moving, indifferent, and Wexley sat awake with a debt. He could no longer tell the difference between honor and cowardice, waiting for a dawn he suddenly, desperately didn't want to arrive. But dawn came anyway. The morning arrived crisp and golden. Marianne saddled Ironclad at 8:30, working through her usual routine. Checking each piece of tack by hand, smelling the leather for any trace of chemical tampering. The girth felt sound. The stitching looked intact from the outside because of course it did. That was the entire point of cutting from underneath the buckle plate, where a hand running along the surface would never think to check. She buckled it snugly, led him out into the yard. Ironclad shifted beneath him, adjusted to the weight, then stood calmly. Wexley rode at the rear, his face blank as fresh paper. His hands, if anyone had looked closely enough, trembling just slightly on the reins. Nobody looked closely enough. They took the river road at a walk, following the water downstream toward the old stone bridge. The road stayed close to the bank, separated from the water by a strip of rough grass and a shallow drop of perhaps 6 feet onto the rocky bed below. At the bridge, Edmund gathered his reins, asked Ironclad for a trot. The stallion responded immediately. The girth held. "He moves beautifully," called Fredericks, Lord Brenner's stable master. "Shall we see him open up a bit, your grace?" Edmund glanced at Marianne. She nodded. He pressed his heels against Ironclad's sides, and the stallion surged forward into a canter, then a full gallop. The power was immediate, enormous, 1,200 pounds of muscle and bone driving forward with a force that made the very ground seem to tremble. The river blurred past on the left in a streak of silver and gray. Then with a sound like a whip crack, the girth gave way. The saddle lurched violently to the right. Edmund felt the whole world tilt beneath him, left stirrup suddenly useless, weight shifting hard toward the rocky bank and the river below, and Ironclad, feeling the sudden shift, stumbled on the uneven ground. Marianne saw it happen from 20 yards back. She didn't think, because there wasn't time to think. Her heels drove into Birch's length, and the mare leaped forward like a coursing hound, closing the gap in 3 thundering strides. She pulled alongside Ironclad's left shoulder, leaned out of her own saddle at an angle that should have unseated her completely, caught the stallion's loose bridle lead in her right hand, hauled back with her full weight, and pulled Birch into a hard sliding stop that dragged Ironclad's head around. He fought it for 2 strides, then answered the familiar hand on his lead, planted his front hooves, skidded to a halt on the packed earth 3 feet 3 from the edge of the bank. Edmund grabbed the horse's mane with both hands and held on while the ruined saddle hung sideways beneath the animal's belly, the severed girth dangling like a dead snake. His face had gone white. "The girth," he managed. "I know," Marianne said. She was already dismounted, already crouching beside the fallen saddle, pulling the severed strap free, holding the buckle end up to the morning light. "These were cut," she said quietly. 12 of the 16 stitching threads, severed with a blade. Someone left just enough to hold during light work and fail under strain. Past Edmund, to where Cormac Wexley sat motionless on his cob at the far end of the bridge, watching the whole scene with an expression that had finally at last begun to crack wide open. Nobody moved for a long moment. The river kept running. Maria's hands were shaking now. She realized, not from fear exactly, the fear had come and gone in the space of those 3 thundering strides, spent entirely in the act of closing the distance between herself and a man about to go over a rocky bank. What she felt now was something that arrived only after the danger had passed, the particular delayed trembling of a body that had spent everything it had in a handful of seconds, and was only now beginning to understand how close the margin had actually been. 3 feet. She kept coming back to that number, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a wound to see how deep it actually goes. 3 feet between a gallop and a rocky riverbed. 3 feet between an ordinary morning and one that would have ended with Edmund Ashworth broken on stones, the way that Grey Gelding's rider had nearly been broken 3 years before, in a parade ground 5 counties and a lifetime away from here. She looked at Edmund, really looked at him, past the shock still draining the color from his face, past the ragged breathing, and understood, with a clarity that startled her, exactly how much this man had come to matter to her in the span of a few short weeks. Not the Duke. Not the wealth, or the title, or any of the things a sensible woman might have been expected to weigh when considering her own prospects. Just Edmund, the particular careful way he watched her work without ever once trying to direct it. The plainness of his honesty, even when honesty cost him something. The fact that he'd offered her back a life that had been stolen from her, expecting nothing in return but her willingness to trust him with the truth. She had very nearly lost him. On a road he owned, in front of his own staff, because of a debt 32 years old that had nothing whatsoever to do with either of them. The unfairness of it sat in her chest like a stone. "Show me," Edmund said. Marianne held up the buckle end. "A thread that breaks from wear looks different than one that's been cut. Worn threads fray outward. These are clean. Straight across every single one." Edmund took the strap, examined it himself. Muscle worked in his jaw, skin like a second heartbeat trying to beat its way out. "Wexley," Edmund said. His voice carried across the bridge. "Come here." Wexley dismounted slowly, walked forward with measured, careful steps. "Your Grace." He stopped 6 feet from Edmund. "Thank God you weren't harmed. The girth must have been defective. Poor stitching from the saddler, most likely." "The stitching was cut, Wexley." Wexley blinked. "Cut, sir?" 12 threads. Severed with a blade along the underside of the buckle plate. This was deliberate. Then someone in Lord Brenner's stable must have. The tack was stored in our section of the guest stables. Our horses, our equipment, our people. Wexley's mouth opened. "Your Grace," his voice faltered. "Just slightly. I hope you're not suggesting that you empty my coat pockets." The words fell like stones into a well. "Your pockets," Edmund said. "Now?" Wexley reached into his left coat pocket first. Produced a handkerchief. "A few coins, a brass button." "The right pocket," Edmund said. Wexley's hand went to his right pocket, stopped. He pulled out the folding pocket knife. Bone handle. He placed it on the wall beside the other items, and his hand shook doing it. "Open it," Marianne said.
"Quiet."
Wexley looked at her. For a moment, something close to fear flashed across his face before it disappeared behind the crumbling remains of the mask he'd worn. He unfolded the blade. The steel was smeared with a thin film of leather oil. Caught in the fine grain of the metal, fragments of waxed linen thread. The same triple waxed thread used in the girth stitching. Fredericks leaned in, examined the blade, straightened up, said nothing, because nothing needed saying anymore. Edmund stared at the knife a long time. "You cut the girth on a horse carrying your employer at a full gallop. On a riverside track." A breath. If the horse had gone over that bank. If Miss Colter had been 1 second slow as intend for anyone to be hurt, Wexley said. The words came out hoarse, rushed. "I only meant to embarrass her methods. To show the horse was still dangerous. I calculated the threads." "Enough, you calculated." Edmund repeated the word like it tasted of something rotten. Wexley had nothing left. The mask was gone entirely now. But here and this was the moment that would echo far beyond that riverbank. Here Cormac Wexley stopped talking about himself. "Your Grace," he said. His voice had changed, steadied oddly. Now that the worst of it was already out in the open air where nothing could take it back. "There's something more you need to know. Something I should have told you days ago." Something I should have told her. His eyes flicked to Marianne, held there, apologetic in a way that surprised everyone watching, including himself. Edmund went very still. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't act alone, I was paid. Instruct 3 weeks ago, by letter, to make the horse difficult to handle. To embarrass Miss Colter's methods. The man who wrote those letters is a man I owe my life to. 32 years ago, on a battlefield I won't describe to you here, he pulled me out from under artillery fire with his own Tusas. I have carried that debt every day since. I thought I was repaying it." "Who?" Edmund said. Wexley's eyes moved once more to Marianne. "Help. Aldous Marrow," he said. The name landed on the bridge like a second cracking sound. Marianne felt the entire morning tilt sideways beneath her. Worse than the saddle had tilted beneath Edmund, because she had never spoken that name aloud to anyone at this estate. And here it was, name. Standing, she remembered with a cold, sick lurk, on the guest list from 3 days ago. Marrow was here, at Thornfield. Right now. "As guest of honor," Frederick said slowly. "Arrived yesterday afternoon. He's staying in the East guest wing." Edmund's expression went through several things: shock, disbelief, understanding, arriving a full step behind where it should. "Miss Colter," he said. Not looking away from Wexley, "the buckle. 3 years ago. The man you suspected but couldn't name." "I never saw his face clearly enough to be certain," Marianne said. Her voice had gone thin tight. "Only that he was stables. The night before the parade, a quiet man. Well dressed, he wore a ring. Gold. Carved with a hawk." Wexley made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He reached into his own coat, slow, careful, and produced a small folded letter, soft at the creases. "This won't prove the buckle," he said, holding it out to Edmund. "But it proves he knew. And it proves what he asked me to do 3 weeks ago." In his own hand, his own seal, Edmund took the letter. "Read it once." His face didn't move. "Read it a second time." And this time something in his jaw set so hard Marianne could see the muscles standing out along the line of it. "He's staying in the East Wing," Edmund said again. "Quiet now, very quiet." "Saddle a fresh horse for me," Edmund said now. Marianne caught his arm before he'd taken 3 steps toward the yard. "Wait," she said. He turned. The look on his face stopped just short of frightening. "He tried to kill me," Edmund said. "On my own land." I know he ruined your career and let another man be punished for asking honest questions about it. I know that too. She held his gaze steady. Which is exactly why you cannot go charging into that guest wing alone, in a fury with nothing but a stolen letter and a bad feeling. A man like that has spent his whole life building rooms full of people who'll believe him over anyone standing in front of him with an accusation, a breath. We need the buckle. Edmund stared at her. The sealed evidence. From the Westminster inquiry. If it still exists, and it should, the fracture pattern on that buckle will match this girth strap. Same method, same signature. Her voice had steadied entirely now. The old training rising up under the fear. That is proof no drawing room can talk its way around. Edmund was quiet a long moment. Something in his face shifted the fury there banked now not directed. You want to expose him properly, he said. Not just accuse him. I want to lose everything, Marianne said. Not just today's argument. Wexley spoke into the pause that followed. There's a man on the review board, he said. The one who was reassigned. I know where he's posted now. If he's willing to speak formally about what he saw in the original fracture report, you'd help with that, Edmund said.
Not quite a question.
I have nothing left to protect by staying silent, Wexley said. Simple. Flat. The only thing left for me to decide is whether I lose everything as the man who cut a girth strap for money, or the man who helped undo the worst thing that was done years before I ever touched a blade to this horse's tack. His eyes went to Marianne, held there steady, for the first time since she'd arrived at the estate. I owe you that much, Miss Colter. But it's what I have to offer. Marianne studied him a long moment. All right, she said finally. Then help us. They did not confront Marrow that day. A rider was dispatched that same evening to the junior officer's current posting, with a letter in Edmund's own hand requesting, with the full weight of a Duke's seal, a formal statement regarding the original fracture report. Another letter went quietly to Colonel Averston herself. Marianne wrote that one with her own hand, and it took her 4 attempts before she managed it without her handwriting shaking too badly to read. Marrow for his part spent that evening as any other guest of honor, might dining well, laughing easily, holding court among Lord Brenner's other guests. He had no idea Marianne was even in the room. The showcase was quietly postponed. A minor injury to the horse, Edmund explained. Nobody questioned it. 2 days passed. Marianne spent the mornings with Ironclad in Thornfield's own training paddock. Edmund watched from the fence most mornings, same as he always had. Wexley kept his head down. Did his work, waited. He'd become in the space of 48 hours, something Marianne hadn't expected to see in him, quiet, careful, watchful in a new direction entirely. You didn't have to help, Marianne told him. The second evening, finding him alone in the tack room. I did though, he said. Not looking up. That's rather the point I've been slow to understand. A pause. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I only wanted you to know I understand now exactly what I did. That's not the same as forgiveness. I know that. No, Marianne said quietly. It isn't. But it's something, she agreed. The writer returned on the third morning. Edmund broke the seal on a formal letter once, twice, and then looked up with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. The officer remembers, he said. Remembers exactly. He raised concerns about the fracture pattern at the time. He was told his concerns weren't relevant to the board's findings. Reassigned within the fortnight to a posting nobody with ambition would consider anything but a demotion. Did he say who dismissed his concerns? Marianne asked. Though she already knew. Marrow, Edmund said. By name, in writing this time, with his own signature attached. Colonel Averston's reply came that same afternoon. My dear Miss Colter, it began. I have carried a weight these 3 years that I suspect matches your own. I did not fight hard enough for you at the time. I told myself the evidence was against you, and I have regretted that cowardice nearly every day since. If what you describe is true, and I confess I find myself believing every word of it, then I will stand before any board, any inquiry, and say plainly what I should have said 3 years ago. You did not fail that inspection, Marianne. Someone failed you. Marianne read it 3 times. Then sat down hard on the nearest bench in the courtyard. Letter pressed against her chest with both hands, and let herself cry properly finally. For the first time in 3 years, while Edmund stood a respectful few feet away, saying nothing, simply present. We have enough, Edmund said, once she'd recovered herself. The letter to Wexley in Marrow's own hand. The officer's testimony. Colonel Averston's willingness to speak formally on your behalf. And he held up the severed girth strap, physical evidence of the exact same method used twice 3 years apart. Enough for what? Marianne asked. Enough to end him, Edmund said, simply. Public, where it can't be talked away over brandy in some private study. They chose the following evening. A formal dinner, already planned as the closing event of the gathering, with nearly 40 guests assembled, landowners, breeders, military men of standing. Marianne wore, for the first time since arriving at Thornfield, a dress the housekeeper had quietly set aside for her. Edmund found her at the edge of the great hall, offered his arm. "Ready?" he asked, quiet. "No," Marianne said honestly. "But I'm going regardless." The dinner proceeded normally for the better part of an hour. Wexley stood near the doorway. Marianne caught his eye once across the room. He gave the smallest possible nod, steady, ready. Edmund rose when the final course had been cleared, tapped his glass once. "Before we conclude this gathering," Edmund said, voice carrying easy and even across the hall, "myself, I get it to raise a matter of some seriousness. One that touches, I'm afraid, on the honor of a man seated at this very table." The murmur died entirely. 2 days ago, on the road leading to this estate, an attempt was made on my life. A deliberately sabotaged girth strap, cut in a manner designed to fail catastrophically at a full gallop. My stable master has confessed, in full, to the act, and to being paid to commit it, by letter, in the hand of a fan he has served with unwavering loyalty for over 30 years. Every eye in the room turned toward Wexley. Merrow's face had gone very still. "This is a grave accusation," he said, carefully. "To raise at a dinner table, you're great. Perhaps a matter better suited to—" "I agree entirely," Edmund said. "Which is why I have not raised it lightly, nor without proof." Wexley stepped forward, set the letter on the table, in full view of every guest. "This is the letter you sent me, sir," he said, voiced, though everyone in the room could see what it cost him, "requesting that I make the horse difficult to handle. Your seal is on it. Your hand wrote it." Gasps, low, moving around the table like a current. "I've no idea what fabrication you're presenting, Cormac," Tro said, voice gone cold now. "Dangerous. A man facing dismissal for his own crimes will say a great many desperate things to shift the blame elsewhere." "Then explain the seal," Edmund said. "Silence. Or explain," Marianne said, rising from her seat, every head turning toward her now. "The fracture pattern on a buckle that failed during a state parade in the capital 3 years ago. The same method, the same signature. A blade drawn carefully underneath, just enough to inspect in and fail exactly when it mattered most." Merrow's face changed. Truly changed for the first time. "You," he said, barely a whisper. "The trainer." "Marianne Colter," she said, steady. Clear, loud enough for every single person at that long table to hear it. "Formerly head trainer of the Crown's Central Stables. Dismissed 3 years ago for a failure that was never mine. A failure I have since learned and can now prove belonged entirely to you." The room had gone absolutely silent. "This is preposterous," Merrow tried. "A dismissed trainer and his disgraced stable master conspiring together." "The officer who first questioned the fracture pattern," Edmund said, cutting cleanly across him, "and who was quietly reassigned for raising those questions, has provided formal written testimony. Colonel Averston has offered to speak on her behalf before any inquiry that convenes." He set the wrapped girth strap on the table beside the letter. "Let the severed threads catch the candlelight. And this, cut 2 days ago on my own land, by a method identical to the one used 3 years earlier. Compare them yourself, sir, if you doubt the resemblance." Merrow said nothing. Lord Brenner, at the head of the table, rose slowly to his feet. "I believe," he said, into the terrible silence, "this gathering has concluded rather earlier than planned." His eyes moved to Merrow. "I will be writing to the advisory council myself in the morning. I would suggest, sir, that you have a great deal to explain and considerably less time to prepare your explanation than you might prefer." The silence after Lord Brenner's words stretched long enough that Marianne could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could hear the small sounds of 40 people trying to decide whether to look at Merrow or away from him, could hear the particular creak of an old house settling around a moment it would remember for years. Merrow rose slowly from his chair. For one terrible instant Marianne thought he might simply deny everything a second time, might reach for some final reserve of the smooth, reasonable charm that had carried him through decades of exactly these kinds of moments, and she braced herself for it, the way she'd braced herself for 3 long years against every possible version of this confrontation, she'd rehearsed in the dark. He didn't, though. He looked at her instead. Really looked at her, for what felt like the first time since recognition had dawned across his face, and something in his expression shifted to a kind of tired, ugly resignation that was almost worse than defiance would have been. "You were talented," he said quietly. "Not to the room, just to her. I want you to know that at least. Whatever else comes of tonight. You were the most talented trainer I'd seen in 20 years of watching this profession, and I destroyed you anyway, because a talented rival was a more immediate threat to me than a mediocre one ever could have been." A breath. I've told myself for 3 years that the Crown's business required certain sacrifices, that contracts and reputations mattered more than one young trainer's career. I find, standing here, that the lie doesn't hold quite as well as it used to. That's not an apology, Marianne said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. No, Marrow agreed. I don't imagine it is. I'm not certain I have one in me. But I wanted you to hear at least once that I knew exactly what I was doing to you. Both times I never once believed you were actually careless with that buckle. I simply needed someone to be blamed who wasn't me. The words landed in the silent hall like stones dropped into still water, ripples moving outward through the assembled fazesks, and Marianne felt something in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph, not even the relief she'd imagined for 3 long years, but something closer to grief. Grief for the version of her career that might have continued, uninterrupted, if this one man hadn't decided her ruin was an acceptable price for his own comfort. Grief, strange as it, for whatever had once made Aldous Marrow capable of pulling a drowning soldier from a collapsed picket line and had somehow, over the intervening decades, curdled into a man who could destroy a young woman's entire life without losing a single night's sleep over it until the consequences finally, inevitably, came calling. Thank you, she said finally, for confirming what I already knew to be true. It wasn't forgiveness. She wanted that understood. In the careful, deliberate way she said it, wanted every person in that hall to understand that gratitude for an honest confession and forgiveness for the act itself were 2 entirely different things, and she intended to offer him only the first. Marrow seemed to understand the distinction perfectly. He gave a single, small nod and said nothing further, and allowed himself to be escorted from the hall by 2 of Lord Brenner's own footmen with what remained of his dignity carefully, deliberately intact. The last performance, Marianne suspected, of a man who had spent his entire life understanding exactly how to manage the way a room perceived him, right up until the very end. Marrow was escorted from the estate before dawn the next morning, in full view of a household staff who would talk about that morning for years afterward. Wexley remained. You cut the girth, Edmund said to him that night in Frederick's borrowed study. You cannot simply return to your post as though nothing happened. I know that, Your Grace. But you also came forward, provided the evidence that will very likely match a man's career and reputation entirely at considerable risk to your own. That matters. It doesn't erase what you did, but it matters. What happens to me now? Wexley asked finally. You'll answer to the proper authorities in time, for what you did on that bridge, Edmund said. But you'll answer as a man who confessed and helped set right a greater wrong, not as one who was merely caught. The formal inquiry into the Westminster buckle reconvened 3 weeks later. Marianne stood before the same board that had stripped her of everything 3 years earlier, and this time Colonel Averston stood beside her, and the officer who'd been quietly reassigned stood on her other side, and Edmund Ashworth sat in the gallery watching, present, exactly as he'd promised he would be. The board reviewed the fracture pattern, compared it formally to the severed girth strap from the river road. The resemblance was undeniable. By late afternoon the board's decision was read aloud, reinstated, rank restored, full record of the original inquiry expunged and replaced with an official acknowledgement of wrongful dismissal. Marianne heard the words land, one by one, and found she couldn't entirely feel them the way she'd imagined she would. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt mostly like something enormous and heavy finally being set down after 3 years of carrying it everywhere she went. Marrow's own hearing, held separately, concluded rather less favorably for him. Stripped of his advisory position, stripped of the military honors he'd carried for decades, and an attempted murder charge, which Edmund had personally insisted be pursued alongside the military inquiry, remained under consideration by the civil authorities. Wexley's own reckoning came gentler than he'd expected, though not gentle by any reasonable measure. Formal censure, the end of his career as a stable master. But no criminal charge given his cooperation and the material role his confession had played in exposing a far greater crime. He left the county quietly, some months later, for a small cottage near the coast. The season turned. Autumn deepened into the sharp, clean cold of early winter, and the manor settled into the particular quiet rhythm of an estate at peace with itself. Ironclad had healed completely, not just the burns. Something deeper too, the last vestiges of the fear that had followed him through 2 separate acts of deliberate cruelty. Finally fully released, he ran free in the west paddock most afternoons now. Edmund found her at the fence one particular evening in late November, the sky gone the color of a healing. There's a formal ceremony planned, he said finally. For your reinstatement, considerable fanfare, I'm told. I'd rather stand here, Marianne said honestly. So would I. He was quiet a moment. But there's something else. The charter. Master of the stables at Vance Manor, full authority over every equine operation, every training program, every staff appointment on this estate. I offered it weeks ago, before any of this happened, and I meant it then. I still mean it now. More than I did before. If that's possible, you're offering it again. I'm making certain you know it still stands, regardless of anything else you might decide about anything. Marianne studied his face a long moment. Edmund, she said. His given name for the first time, and she watched something in his face soften at the sound of it. I accept the charter. Good, he said. Quiet, careful not to let too much show in his voice, though it showed anyway, in his eye, in the small, real smile that followed. Ironclad slowed his running, trotted back toward toward the sound of Marianne's voice, and pressed his great head against her shoulder. She ran her hand along his jaw. 2 fingers, pressed gently below the ear, the old language. The one she'd carried through disgrace and exile, and a flower stall in a market town, through a market square scream that had changed everything, through betrayal and confession and a reckoning years in the making, the one that had in the end brought her exactly here. Come on then, she said softly, to the horse, to the evening, to the man's, standing quiet and steady beside her. Let's go home. The 3 of them walked down toward the manor together as the last light went out of the sky, the lamps in the windows below beginning to glow, one by one, warm against the coming dark, welcoming them back, at last, to a place that had finally fully become exactly what a home was supposed to be. Spring came slowly to the valley that year, the way it always did in that part of the country, reluctant and stubborn, snow lingering in the shadowed hollows long after the fields had begun to green. Marianne stood in the training paddock on the first truly warm morning of the season, watching a new arrival circle the fence line with the same wary, wide-eyed suspicion Ironclad had once carried in every line of his body. A young mare this time, barely broke, sold cheap by a breeder 2 counties over who'd given up trying to manage her temper. She was not the trainer at Vance Manor anymore. That much had changed too in the months since the inquiry. Word traveled. In the particular way word always traveled among people who cared about horses, quietly, through letters and casual mentions at markets, and the kind of conversation that happens over a fence rail between 2 people who speak the same language. Word of the flower seller who tamed an unrideable warhorse in 15 seconds. Word of the trainer reinstated by the crown itself, who managed animals other men had given up on entirely. 3 young apprentices worked under her now, sent by families who could afford the arrangement, and desperate enough for their sons and daughters to learn a gentler method than the one most stables still practiced. She taught them the old language, piece by piece, the way Colonel Averston had once taught her. 2-finger press, the patience of silence, the particular art of listening to an animal that had never been asked gently what was actually wrong. Colonel Averston herself had visited twice since the inquiry concluded, the old woman making the long journey from the capital with a stiffness in her joints that she complained about constantly and seemed privately rather proud of enduring anyway. You've built something remarkable here, she told Marianne on her second visit, standing at the same paddock fence where so much had already happened. Better than what we had in the capital, if I'm honest, though I'd deny saying so to anyone who might repeat it. I had good teachers, Marianne said. You had one good teacher who failed you when it mattered most, Averston said, with the particular bluntness Marianne remembered from her earliest training days. I've made my peace with that failure as best I can. I don't expect you to make yours so easily. But I'm glad, all the same, that you found your way back to this. The crown's loss was this valley's considerable gain. Wexley wrote once that spring, a single letter, brief and carefully worded, sent from the small coastal cottage where he'd settled after leaving the county. He didn't ask for anything, didn't request forgiveness, or a character reference, or any of the things a lesser man might have angled for. He wrote only to say that he'd taken up fishing, of all things, and found it suited him better than he'd expected. The patience of it, the long quiet hours with nothing required of him but attention and stillness. He wrote that he thought of the horse sometimes, and hoped he was well. He wrote that he understood if she chose never to reply, and that the writing of the letter itself had been its own kind of accounting, regardless of whether an answer ever came back. Marianne read it twice, folded it carefully, did not reply immediately, though she kept the letter, tucked into the same small chest where she'd once kept an unworn dress, and found herself, some months later, writing back after all not forgiveness exactly, but an acknowledgement, a closing of one particular ledger, even if the larger accounts of the world would never balance as neatly as anyone might wish. Some debts she was learning didn't resolve into clean victories or clean condemnations. They simply eventually stopped being carried quite so heavily. That was its own kind of ending, she supposed. Not the triumphant kind that made for good telling around a fire, but real all the same, and perhaps more honest than the other kind ever managed to be. Edmund found her in the paddock most mornings still, same as he always had, though the fence between them had become, over the intervening months, considerably less necessary than it once was. He asked her to marry him in early summer, on a morning much like the one that had started everything, mist still thick in the low places, the grass wet enough to soak through a boot, Ironclad grazing nearby with the unbothered contentment of an animal who had long since stopped expecting the world to hurt him. He didn't make a production of it. That wasn't his way, she'd learned, not in the months of quiet mornings and evening brandy and careful, patient courtship that had followed the reckoning at Thornfield. He simply stood beside her at the fence the way he always did and said the words plainly, the way he said most things that mattered to him. "I've spent my whole life being told what I was meant to want," he said. "The estate, the title, the proper marriage to the proper family, arranged for reasons that had nothing to do with anything as inconvenient as affection." A pause. "I find I no longer care very much what I was meant to want. I only care what I actually do want. And what I want, Marianne, more than anything this estate could offer me, is you, standing at this fences. For the rest of whatever years I'm given." She didn't answer right away, stood a long moment, watching the mist begin to burn off the valley floor, watching Ironclad lift his great head to study them both with the mild curiosity of a creature who understood, in his own way, that something significant was happening and would have preferred, on the whole, an apple to go with it. "Yes," she said finally, simple, steady. The same way she'd once said the word to a horse in a market square, 3 years and a lifetime ago, before she understood that saying yes to a frightened, difficult thing could sometimes be the bravest word a person had in them. "Yes, Edmund, I'll marry you." They were wed that autumn, in the manor's own small chapel, with a guest list considerably smaller and considerably stranger than most weddings among the nobility. Colonel Averston attended. Seated near the front in a dress uniform she insisted on wearing despite having been retired from active service some years. Phillips and Dawson stood among the household staff, both of them looking faintly astonished to have been invited at all. Lord Brenner sent his regrets and a rather extravagant gift of silver, along with a note expressing his continued admiration for how the whole unfortunate business with Marrow had ultimately been resolved. Marrow himself was by then a name rarely spoken in polite company. His trial concluded, his sentence served, his once formidable reputation reduced to a cautionary tale told in hushed tones at dinner parties about the dangers of building an entire life on the assumption that power excused cruelty. Ironclad did not attend the ceremony, obviously, though Marianne visited him in his stall that morning before the service, dressed in white, and pressed her forehead against his neck the way she had 100 times before. "You started all of this," she told him softly. "You know that, don't you? Every bit of it, a scared, angry horse in a market square, and here we are." He huffed against her shoulder, unbothered, entirely uninterested in the philosophical weight of the moment, and nosed instead at the pocket of her dress in the hopeful, familiar way that had become, over the better part of a year, simply who he was now. Not the terror of Ashmore, not the untouchable 3 cavalry regiments had given up on, just Ironclad, patient, trusting the hand that had never once given him reason not to. She laughed and found an apple after all, tucked into her sleeve for exactly this purpose, and fed it to him slowly while the church bells began to ring across the valley, calling her toward the rest of her life. Years later, long after the manor had settled into the particular comfortable rhythm of a household grown, long after apprentices had come and gone, and Ironclad himself had grown gray around the muzzle and slow in his gait, people in the county would still tell the story of the flower seller and the war horse, embellishing it a little more with each retelling, the way good stories always accumulate small improvements in the mouths of people who love them. Marianne never minded the embellishments. Let the story grow a little in the telling if it wanted to. The heart of it had never needed exaggeration anyway. A frightened creature, a frightened woman, and the particular patient courage it took for either of them to finally fully trust again. That much at least had always been entirely true. And perhaps that was the whole of it in the end. Not the titles, or the inquiries, or the careful machinery of justice that had finally, after 3 long years, ground its way toward something resembling fairness. Just 2 creatures who had learned the hard way that trust was a thing you rebuilt one patient hour at a time, hands and a quiet voice, and never once by force. Marianne thought of that often in the years that followed. Standing at the paddock fence some evenings, watching new arrivals circle the fence line the way Ironclad once had, wary and wide-eyed and certain the world meant them harm. She never rushed them. She'd learned long before any of this that the animals who healed fastest were never the ones pushed hardest. They were the ones given room enough to decide in their own time that the hand reaching toward them wasn't going to hurt them after all. It had taken her 3 years to learn that lesson about herself too. 3 years of small rented rooms and dried flowers, and a name nobody asked her to explain, before a market square and a handful of crushed lavender had finally gently coaxed her back toward trusting the world again. She counted herself fortunate, most days, that the lesson had come to her at all. Some people never got the chance. Some people carried their fear the whole of their lives, never once finding the particular combination of patience and courage required to set it down she had. And she intended, for as many years as she was given, to help as many frightened, difficult creatures find their own way toward the same quiet peace she'd finally found for herself, two-legged and four. It hardly mattered which, because the old language she'd come to understand had never really been about horses at all. It had always simply been about learning, patiently, how to ask a frightened thing what was wrong, and waiting, without demanding, for an honest answer. That was the whole of the old language, really, once you stripped away the pressure patterns and the pouches of dried herbs, and the careful practiced stillness of a body that had learned not to flinch. Underneath all of it, it had only ever been kindness, offered patiently enough, for long enough, that something wounded finally believed it was safe to stop bracing. Ironclad had taught her that as much as she had ever taught him, perhaps more.